After World War II, the German state was utterly destroyed. It was split in 4 parts, and to top it all, coming face to face with the scale of the atrocities their government and armies committed through public events like the Nuremberg trials. This, in combination with the process of denazification, which can be seen as a large-scale rehabilitation program, and the regaining of independence, albeit as 2 states, helped the German people in the 50s to begin looking towards the future, burying the past. It was not just a lost war, which people can accept while still feeling proud about their deeds during it, as perhaps the French used to view Napoleon's efforts, which ended in defeat, or Austria's defeats in the 7 Years' War. Rather, in this case, the sensation after the war seems to have been similar to a person regaining their senses after having committed acts of violence under the influence, akin to a crowd cheering for a football team or other such instances of mob mentality which all humans are susceptible. Naturally, given all the revelations after the war and the atrocities committed, the Germans collectively wanted nothing more than to forget and focus on new goals. First the economy, which led to the German economic miracle, and then on the foundation of the European Union, of which in the coming decades it would arguably become the leading country. But what about the history books in school? After all, typical after any conflict, whether a given side is the winner or the loser, the history taught in schools tends to be coloured to favour one's own people. This, however, could not happen in Germany. The reasons for this were varied, from making sure something like that couldn't happen again, and of course the scale of the atrocities on a global level and the small time gap that separates us from those events and how well documented those events are. This brings us to the broad strokes of how this particular conflict was and is taught in German schools. We should point out here that in Germany the education system is regulated not by the federal government but independently in each of the 16 states that constitute the German Federal Republic, or BRD. So the way history is taught, although generally falling within the same lines, can vary a lot from region to region. For example, the choice of literature used in the various classes differs greatly, not only from year to year but also from federal state to federal state. That caveat out of the way, the study of the war period and how this is viewed in German schools can be generally divided into 4 parts. The first, the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, at least its beginnings, are generally viewed positively. It is seen as a first decent effort towards democratization, despite the problems that it faced in the aftermath of World War I. The various problems culminating in the economic crisis of the late 20s and the subsequent rise of the Nazi regime are dealt with in detail, emphasizing the mistakes that would lead to the fall of the democratic system. One would say that the Weimar Republic, despite the brevity of its existence, is viewed with a certain nostalgic sentiment, accompanied by the looming threat of what was to come. And that is not just the war, but the Nazis themselves and their ideology. Nazi ideology and atrocities. Head-on, the students are confronted with the crushing effects of totalitarian regimes, radical ideologies, and where these can lead. In addition to photo and video documentaries, most schools organize mandatory school trips to Holocaust memorials, usually former concentration camps. This does not only apply to history class. Students are also introduced to the works of literature tackling the issue of Nazism and ethnic hate in Europe at the time. This can include, but is not limited to, authors such as Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann. Additionally, Jewish voices are amplified in terms of Jewish poetry, reports from survivors, and historical documentaries focusing on the long-term consequences of hate and violence. Some of the literature choices indicate that the schools try to emphasize the aspects of humanity and also the problem of group mentality and prejudice, as seen in works such as the post-war play Andorra by Max Frisch and more recent works such as The Boy in the Striped Pajamas from 2006 by John Boyne and The Reader by Bernhard Schlink. They also look at the diaries of Anne Frank. Excerpts of pro-Nazi texts are also studied once the students are deemed mature enough to handle this. In this vein, excerpts from Mein Kampf are tackled in advanced history class, stressing the contradictions within the text, what contemporary citizens might have identified with, and the lack of morality therein. Interestingly, as if to complement Nazi ideology with a similar type of prejudice, the other major topic focused on intensely is that of slavery, racism, and segregation in America. The war itself. Remarkably, the details of the fields of war are often underplayed in German schools. A possible reason for this is that showing maps of expanding German territory during the first 2 years of the war and discussing their winning battles might cause encouragement of nationalistic pride, which seems counterproductive to many given the points that educators are trying to teach. Furthermore, the discussion of the details of each battle that Rommel won or lost in Africa, or the supply problems on the Eastern Front, are not vital to the analysis of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Another more practical aspect is that already much time has been allocated to the subject of war anyway, so they cut down on the actual battles. Of course, one downside of de-emphasizing this is many German students are never really made aware of many specific military events and conquests, since most emphasis in school is put on the internal developments, theoretical or philosophical aspects, and of course on the ideology and practice of ethnic cleansing and the ruthlessness to other groups of people seen as ethnic, cultural, or political outcasts, such as Jews, homosexuals, communists, etc. The result is that the military developments of war are understated, as alluded to. The result is that, shockingly, many German students are actually surprised to learn things like that Germans invaded places like modern Ukraine, modern Serbia, and Greece. In contrast to these broader war strokes, resistance against the Nazi regime within Germany is heralded as an example of heroism and bravery, one such example being the siblings Sophie and Hans Scholl, members of the resistance group the White Rose. Such examples allow German students to find figures from the wartime with whom they can identify with. On this note, not every regular German who lived in the 1930s and 40s is painted as a terrible person. After all, when dealing with such a large group, as in any populace, there are plenty of good people and a percentage of bad. That said, given all that happened, a large emphasis is put on even most of the good people being complicit in the atrocities by looking away and not doing anything to stop it. Defeat and post-war. The major destructions in Germany and the high cost of human lives during the war is not attributed to the Allies, but rather to the Nazi regime itself, which is being viewed as the perpetrator in starting an unnecessary war in the first place. Furthermore, most of the destruction on German soil was inflicted in the last year of the war. The obstinacy of not surrendering, even as it was clear that the outcome of the war would be negative, is seen as proof of the minimal care the Nazis expressed toward their own people. The suicide of members of the party, such as Himmler and Hitler himself, is seen as an act of cowardice on their part. Thus, rather unique in history, the opposing forces who were victorious are not generally seen in a negative light by those they defeated. Far from it. On that note, the occupation of the German cities by the Allied army is characterized as liberation. This is despite, of course, the fact that the Allied soldiers at the time didn't seemingly view the race to Berlin as a race to free Berlin. The choice of words, however, comes with the emphasis that by losing the war, the German people were freed from Nazism. An interesting example comes from alternative history broadcasts that contemplate a world after supposed German victory. These paint a horrific dystopia in which the Germans, as well as the occupied people, would be suppressed by a ruthless Nazi regime. The 8th of May is therefore known as the Day of Liberation. Making parallels to the way the European Renaissance supposedly liberated the medieval people, the liberation as well as the denazification process led to an internal catharsis among Germans concerning Nazism. Reflecting all of this in popular German cinema, German war films, especially in the last few decades, tend to deal with the subject with honesty, showing the gradual shift to madness caused by hollow mass delusions, often in a tone more fatalistic than heroic. Therefore, they can be much deeper than a typical war movie, and if you're up for that, you might enjoy work such as the Generation War miniseries. There's also the movie The Fall, perhaps mostly known thanks to the most meme-ified Hitler scene ever. Of course, one major issue of all this in the way it's taught in schools and extreme emphasis placed on this period of history is the subject of imposed collective responsibility on modern Germans, even if just implied or felt rather than ever explicitly stated. At first glance, it is good to study these events in great detail to make sure they don't happen again. However, an issue for Germans, of course, is the sense of collective responsibility, despite no student today or their parents or even potentially their grandparents having anything to do with any of that. How much weight does the idea of original sin have? How is a person born in the 2000s responsible for the Nazi atrocities? It is still heavily frowned upon to display the modern-day German flag, despite officially and explicitly not being a Nazi symbol. On a similar note, a nationalistic display such as pledging allegiance to the flag during class every morning would have the worst possible connotations in Germany, despite being common in places like the United States. Furthermore, there is a high percentage of population with immigrant heritage. Just look at the German national football team. As you might expect from all of this, there is some concern that the German school systems may go too far with the seeming obsession with the Nazis and all the mistakes that they were making, instead of spending more time on broader history, as is more typical typical in other nations. Whatever one's opinion on that, as an interesting little side note, the German denazification process was considered such a success that decades later Americans sought to apply a same methodology after occupying Iraq. Unsurprisingly, that was not exactly successful. Regarding the reception of World War II, especially within the educational system of countries that participated in the war, one would expect that many broad facts are common knowledge, and as happens with most all wars in history, each nation biases things a little bit to make themselves look better in their own history books, regardless of what actually happened. As we recently covered, however, the Germans and World War II are a rather interesting exception to this rule. You can see our video, How Do the Germans Teach About World War II, for more on that, obviously. This brings us to a top voted question from that video. How does one of Germany's chief allies in that war, Japan, teach about World War II and their country's part in that historic conflict? This is seemingly asked as, while perhaps not to the scale of Germany, the Japanese military was notorious for its behavior as an occupying army and its extreme use of force, leading to enslavement of parts of populations and widespread massacres. The scars this period left in the formerly occupied countries are felt to this very day, not only in the history books but also in works of art and literature such as Dragon's Seed by Pearl S. Bach. More specifically, these war crimes resulted in the deaths of between 3 and 14 million people and include systematic extermination, such as the massacre at Nanjing in late 1937-1938. At the time, Nanjing was the capital of China, and the death toll is estimated at between 50 and 300,000 people. Sometimes specific groups were targeted, such as the Hui people. Furthermore, virtual enslavement of people took place as laborers or in forced prostitution. For example, the use of sex slaves, known as comfort women, was systematic and widespread in Korea, China, Thailand, and many other countries under the yoke of the Japanese at the time. Additionally, captors were used for experimentation. Most notorious is Unit 731, a military unit established by an imperial order that conducted experiments on civilians. Building from the ashes, literally, of a previous program, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731 for short, was authorized in 1936. Bases were established at various places in China, including at Pinfang and Hishiking. Referring to their victims as maruta, meaning logs, the researchers experimented on apparently anyone they could get their hands on: Chinese, Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, Pacific Islanders, other Southeast Asians, and even a few American prisoners of war, all fell victim to the doctors at the camps. Taking the scientific method to new lows, the researchers in Unit 731 conducted a variety of experiments. For example, effects of lethal doses. Victims were purposefully infected with fatal, contagious diseases like the bubonic plague, so researchers could learn exactly how the diseases affected the human body. Because they feared that decomposition, which begins immediately once a person dies, might corrupt tissues, they dissected their victims alive. Likewise, because they were worried that drugs might blemish their findings, the victims were given no anesthetic. Rather, they were vivisected while fully conscious of what was happening. Next up, we have limb amputation. The scientists wanted to learn the limits of the human body and so conducted a number of tests on their victims' arms and legs. Sometimes the limbs were frozen and thawed in order to study how frostbite and gangrene developed. At other times, limbs were cut off and sewn back onto the other side of the body. In a few experiments, when the limbs were removed, researchers just observed the loss of blood. Moving on from there, many victims had all or part of their organs removed, and some even had organs detached, then reattached in unique ways nature never intended. Experiments were also conducted with high pressure, poisonous chemical exposure, centrifuges, burning, blood infusions from animals, burying, and x-rays. Of course, since the purpose of these tests was to determine how much a body could withstand, the experiments would generally continue until the test subject was dead. Given all of this, it may or may not surprise you to hear from people raised in Japan that they hardly learned 20th century Japanese history in class. For example, in a BBC report from 2013, it is noted that one major Japanese school's history book contains only 19 out of 357 pages dealing with events between 1931 and 1945, with, for example, the Nanjing Massacre occupying only one line. As historian Stephen E. Ambrose wrote, the Japanese presentation of the war to its children runs something like this. One day, for no reason we ever understood, the Americans started dropping atomic bombs on us. But is this actually an accurate summation, or is it simply cherry-picked by the victors? To really dive into it, it's necessary to understand a little bit about the school systems of Japan. It turns out what you learn as a student in Japan can be directly related to which school you attend, but also in which decade you were born. In Japan, unlike, say, most EU countries, the books used in schools are issued by private companies instead of a central authority. The Ministry of Education's role is limited to the approval of the various books. Subsequently, each school district can then choose the book from the list of approved material. This system was initially thought of as a beneficiary step in the aftermath of the World War, as it represented one aspect of spreading American capitalistic views of privatization in Japan. It also, at least on the surface, prevented the interference of the political system in education, which at the time seemed like a good idea since this political system was born and raised within the recently defeated Japanese Empire. However, as previously alluded, the government still has a say in the process, since a special board within the Ministry of Education carries the task of approving the content of the textbooks before making them available on the book list. At this step, it has used its power to reject drafts for reasons that are seen as controversial. Allegedly, simply mentioning wrongdoings committed by the Japanese Empire before 1945 has, in some instances, constituted enough reason for exclusion from the school textbook lists. These cases are found not just in the 1950s, but also in the 2000s. An important note is it is not the mere mention of massacres, such as Nanjing, that could cause the exclusion of a book, but the use of negative tone regarding the way the Japanese Empire acted in general at the time. So, although the government is not officially denying the crimes, it does not seem to actively discourage the wave of war crime deniers, even from members of the parliament. This seems an odd choice, especially when compared to other defeated nations of the same war, such as Germany, where, as in 17 other European countries, denying the Holocaust is explicitly against the law. Furthermore, in the education system of these countries, the war crimes are dealt with in excruciating detail, and not only in history class, but extending to almost all other subjects, maybe only maths and physics aside. As for directly after the war, unlike the Nazi regime in Germany or the fascist administration in Italy, the defeated leadership of Japan could not be used as an easily isolated political scapegoat to attribute all of the nation's crimes to. In fact, the leadership of Japan did not seem to change as dramatically as in other Axis countries after the war. The figurehead of the Emperor Hirohito, for example, remains in place, although deprived of many of his powers and abdicating his godhood. The result is that the newly formed democracy had many links to a period which the Japanese wanted, and perhaps still want, to be proud of. In contrast to the European Axis powers, the Japanese Empire did not have a predecessor which could be used as a basis for a new or re-established system of government. Furthermore, although the US forces occupying Japan under General MacArthur between 1945 and 1952 led many accused war criminals to military tribunals, many of the high-ranking officials allegedly guilty of war crimes actually escaped judgment. That said, after the war, the Japanese officially issued many apologies and reached settlements with former colonized countries such as South Korea in 1965, but at the same time, as mentioned, the generations raised after the war tended to learn very little of the atrocities committed during the war. One of the many reasons for this was the entanglement of the Cold War policy with that teaching history. In July 1955, 2 years after the end of the War of Korea, textbooks containing the atrocities of the Japanese army were condemned by the Japanese parliament. The stated reason for this was that the textbooks should not aid in presenting the now communist countries in a favorable light. The invasion of China and the occupation of Manchuria were to be omitted when possible. Textbooks explicitly dealing with Japanese wrongdoings against countries that used the war as a way to attack the capitalist Japanese and therefore enforce policies that could be seen as communist were characterized as red textbooks within the rising Cold War tensions. The new requirement formed was that the wars Japan was involved in during the 30s and 40s were not to be criticized. This movement escalated, causing the banning of more than a quarter of the books used in schools at that time. One solution to avoid the ban was for authors to skip this period entirely or focus on it only in a very summarizing way. So it's not surprising that history books would have more pages regarding the Pleistocene epoch than the Pacific War. Moreover, the entanglement with Cold War policies might explain why the Americans were okay with this and didn't really push for anything different in the aftermath of the war. Going forward in time, the Cold War would not remain the major factor behind this view towards history, and indeed, in many cases, Japanese citizens would seek out learning opportunities about the war, despite the dark aspects of their country's past, if not always through school itself, then by other means, such as exposure to Western media. But nevertheless, the controversies have not ceased, in large part due to the rise of nationalism on both sides. As you might imagine from this, despite this all having occurred many decades ago, when even many of our grandparents were still in diapers, the lack of a full education on these matters and the reasons behind them can cause a series of tensions. For example, Japan and South Korea. To an outside observer, the two countries, from a geopolitical and strategic view, should have been close allies. They are, broadly speaking, similar in their political institutions, commerce, and industry mentality, and face similar challenges in trade and politics, for example, with respect to North Korea, China, and Russia. Despite this, the two countries show a strong antagonism, sometimes with intentional sabotage of each other's industry, a policy which has been dubbed a trade war. The reason seems to stem in part from the tensions surrounding the Japanese-Korean history, as can be clearly seen in news tabloids. Stances, as those mentioned previously, regarding denial of the war abuses are met with harsh critique, which in turn is sometimes answered. One example is the Korean Supreme Court's decision in 2012 in favor of victims or their surviving families on the issue of seeking reimbursement for work done during their enslavement that benefited Japanese industry. Such a possibility would hit many Japanese companies hard. Indeed, for Japan, any talk of monetary reparation was considered to be over following the 1965 agreement, which ended in more than $2 billion being paid to the Korean government as compensation, which in fact was an admission of guilt. Although the two countries have come to an agreement since, the tension in principle remains unresolved. In contrast, as a result of Germany and Germans taking collective responsibility for their actions during the war, their alliance with countries such as France, with whom a harmonized relationship of cooperation developed post-war, occurred relatively quickly, despite the fact that centuries-old rivalry existed even aside from the occupation during the Second World War. Would it have been so if Germany hadn't immediately chosen to take such extreme responsibility for its actions during the war? In the end, almost all nations tend to view a period in which they were the most powerful favorably. It comes as no surprise that this period of power is most often linked with some kind of military expansion, accompanied by a "we are better than the others" view, which almost inevitably leads to the feeling of national superiority, intolerance, and varied acts of cruelty, sometimes in a widespread and horrific form. In short, the abuse of the so recently gained power. Japan is not the exception, but rather the rule in this regard, as almost all nations of the world tend to follow this trend, more or less, with their own histories. From October 1945 to October 1948, almost 1,700 Nazi officers and officials underwent the famous Nuremberg trials, charged with committing war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The trials resulted in 200 death sentences, while 279 defendants were to serve life prison terms. Similar trials for similar charges were conducted in Tokyo from April 1946 to November 1948, bringing to account 28 defendants among the militaristic leadership of Imperial Japan, though for various reasons of benefit to the United States, massive efforts were put in place to make sure the imperial family were not only absolved of any wrongdoing, but a major propaganda campaign was put in place to give the false impression to the rest of the world that the imperial family had been mere puppet leaders instead of actively in charge and well aware of the extreme atrocities, as was actually the case. The US also not only absolved the physicians and scientists in charge of the extreme atrocities committed in research facilities like Unit 731, but also paid money for some of their files because they wanted the research that the mass murderers had done on human subjects, as it was much more scientifically conducted than the Nazis' own data, and was thus deemed to be potentially useful in the upcoming potential conflict with the Soviets. See our, unsurprisingly age-restricted 2-hour documentary, Swept Under the Rugs, The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, in which we dive into all of that, as well as the shocking number of atrocities the Allies committed in the Pacific Theater that are also generally swept under the rug today. As a little brief aside of that tale, you know when the card-carrying Nazi comes out as arguably the greatest hero of the entire story in the Pacific Theater, that something has gone very, very wrong on all sides. But going back to the topic of today, Nazi leadership was particularly held accountable. Some of the Japanese side were made to take the blame for the rest, and that's the Axis powers sorted, right? Well, at least there's two Axis powers on which most historical accounts and fictional media tend to focus. But what about the oft-forgotten third wheel, Italy? Despite the frequently depicted stereotype of Italians as good folk, Italian regular armed forces, security forces, and fascist militia also conducted atrocities on par with their more talked-about Axis allies and the less talked-about atrocities of their enemies. But the victors hold the trials to make their enemies pay for what they did, while generally simultaneously sweeping under the rug their own atrocities, and fascist Italy was one of the losers. So why were they not brought to trial in Italian Nuremberg? Well, let's dive into it, shall we? And we'll kick things off by briefly dispelling the myth of the Italian soldier as the chill member of the Axis club of uniformed baddies. Fascist crimes. At its inception, Italian fascism did not put forth policies to radically eliminate entire ethnic or religious groups deemed undesirable. Nonetheless, after gaining power in October 1922, Benito Mussolini's regime pursued aggressive nationalist and expansionist policies, first with anti-insurgency actions in Libya, an Italian colony since 1911, then with the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, next with the occupation of Albania in April 1939, to say nothing of the ongoing occupation of Eritrea and Somalia under the Italian flag since the late 19th century. Then, after entering World War II in 1940, Italian troops participated in the invasion and/or occupation of more territories in France, Greece, Yugoslavia, Eastern North Africa, as well as the Soviet Union. Across all these territories, and throughout this period, fascist forces engaged in regular war crimes and crimes against humanity, targeting enemy combatants, partisan forces, and civilian populations. A regular protagonist of such occurrences was General and later Field Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. Graziani had distinguished himself by conducting a brutal anti-insurgency campaign in Libya, culminating with the execution of the resistance leader Amal al-Mukhtar on September 16, 1931. According to historian Ali Abdulatif Ahmida, writing for the Cambridge World History of Genocide, al-Mukhtar was but one among an estimated 83,000 victims of Graziani's colonial campaign. Marshal Graziani went on to offer his services during the conquest of Ethiopia, overseeing the mass murder of prisoners, the use of banned weapons such as poison gas, and the bombing of Red Cross hospitals and ambulances. After achieving victory, Graziani was appointed viceroy in charge of the new colony. On February 19, 1937, the viceroy was almost killed in an assassination attempt which unleashed a wave of reprisals against local officials and civilians. This massacre, known as the Yekatit 12 in the Amharic language, is cited as resulting in as many as 30,000 deaths. Some weeks later, on May 20th, 1937, Italian troops perpetrated another infamous atrocity, the massacre of up to 1,000 monks at the Debre Libanus monastery. The case of Marshal Graziani was not an isolated one, with plenty of mass-murdering officers to keep us company. One such gentleman was General Mario Roata, known as the Black Beast to his own soldiers. As the head of the Italian Second Army stationed in Yugoslavia from early 1942, he established a reign of terror in Croatia and Slovenia, responsible for the death of more than 13,000 individuals, variously killed by firing squad, beatings, arson, torture, as well as simple malnutrition and disease due to mistreatment in concentration camps. Climbing down the ranks, we can also find cases of privates and non-commissioned officers who displayed levels of cold-blooded violence on par with the worst of serial killers. A particularly chilling example is that of Sergeant Luciano Liberti, known as the Executioner of Albenga. After serving in an artillery regiment, Liberti enrolled in the Italian SS. This happened in the confusing aftermath of the Italian armistice of September 1943, a military political mess which we shall cover in detail later. But at the time, Liberti was stationed in Albenga, not far from Genoa, and put in charge of interrogating captured anti-fascist partisans. In his new role, he was in charge of countless tortures, beatings, sexual abuses, executions, and occasional straight-out murders, thus earning his nickname. After the war, his personal death toll was estimated to be at around 200, an accusation which he staunchly contested. You see, by his own estimate, he claims it was more like 300. The extent of Italian atrocities was not lost on the Allied powers, who considered fascist criminals to be on par with their German and Japanese colleagues. As such, as early as January 1942, the representatives of 18 Allied governments held an inter-Allied conference on the punishment of war crimes, during which they signed a declaration pledging to investigate, prosecute, and judge, to quote, those guilty or responsible for the commission of acts of violence inflicted upon the civilian populations, whatever the nationality. And of course, this would include Italians. Following this up, in October 1943, Allied leadership set up the United Nations War Crimes Commission, or UNWCC, an independent body to investigate evidence of war crimes and identify potential perpetrators. And 1 month later, on November 1st, 1943, the leaders of the UK, US, and USSR adopted the Moscow Declaration, in which they explicitly agreed that Italian war criminals had to be brought to justice. In the period from 1943 to 1948, the UNWCC identified over 1,200 Italian nationals suspected of having committed extensive and systematic crimes in territories occupied by the fascist regime. And then there were the fascist concentration camps. The extent of the atrocities here was little known at the time, but in recent years, the efforts of researchers such as Andrea Giuseppini and Roman Herzog have brought to life some rather poignant examples. In a nutshell, from 1922 to 1943, while Benito Mussolini was the head of the government of the Kingdom of Italy, fascist authorities administered a total of 135 concentration camps, 85 forced labor camps, 651 prisons holding both common criminals and political prisoners, as well as 107 prisoner of war camps. Going over all of this in any real detail would make this video both demonetized and likely age restricted, let alone be many hours long, so we're going to focus on just 2 examples of the hundreds. The first is the camp of Danan, built in Somalia at the end of 1935 to detain POWs from the Italo-Ethiopian War, as well as dissident elite locals loyal to Emperor Haile Selassie. Between February and May 1937, the population of the camp sharply increased, following the already mentioned massacres of Yekatit 12 and Debre Libanos. In the ensuing months, more and more prisoners, including women and children, were concentrated at Danan to build roads or fell trees. Torture, interrogation, and arbitrary beatings were frequently called out in a specially dedicated area. But the more deadly aspects of these facilities was more that of neglect and the general inhumane conditions. Specifically, there were the frequent outbreaks of things like malaria and pneumonia and other health maladies brought about by the sanitary conditions of the camp, described as disastrous by the Italian medics themselves. Survivor Imru Zaleki reported how the unfortunate who fell ill were taken to a tent outside the camp and simply left to themselves to die. He states, very few of them resisted more than 2 or 3 days before dying. Another survivor, civil servant Mikhail Tassima, denounced the actions of the medical director, Captain Antonino Niosi. In his official report, Dr. Niosi boasted how the prisoners' health is optimal, their diet is perfect, the healthcare provided is dutiful. Mr. Tassima had a different perspective. If the prisoners fell ill, the captain said it would have been better for them to die, and he killed them with an injection of strychnine and arsenic. Others who came to him to be treated were restrained and subjected to surgery against their will. And as for that perfect diet much vaunted by the captain, this actually consisted of hardtack, maggot-infested rice, and polluted water from the camp's only well. Overall mortality at this camp was estimated by Giuseppini and Herzog's research at 3,175 deaths. While that might seem like a small number, it should be noted that Danan was a relatively small facility which housed a total of 6,500 prisoners while in activity. This puts the death rate at a staggering 49%. The second example was the brainchild of General Mario Roata, the Black Beast. As the head of the Italian Second Army stationed in Yugoslavia, in May 1942, Roata ordered the construction of a concentration camp on the island of Rab in Croatia. By October, Roata had ordered some 8,260 prisoners, mostly Slovenian partisans and dissidents, to be housed in the camp long before construction had been completed. As a result, the internees were cramped into improvised tents or dilapidated shacks, and all had horrible sanitary conditions. Italian guards ensured prisoners stayed in line via frequent beatings. But as with Danan, the chief murderers were exposure and malnutrition, brought about by a daily menu of just 80 grams of bread and a bowl of soup cooked inside fuel drums. Starvation was such a rampant issue that even Fascist Party official Emilio Grazioli filed a complaint with the Second Army in December 1942. General Gambara from Roata's staff replied that it was, to quote, right for a concentration camp not to become a fattening camp. A sick individual is a subdued individual. Almost 1,500 of those subdued individuals eventually died at Rab, bringing the death rate to 18%, a higher mortality rate than the infamous Nazi camp at Buchenwald. It should also be mentioned that Roata had also concentrated at Rab some 1,000 Jewish civilians, which he actually went to great lengths to protect from the Germans and the Ustasha, the Croatian fascist militia. Because of this, these Jewish prisoners allegedly enjoyed better living conditions than the other inmates. Roata was just one of several officers and civil servants, many of them card-carrying fascists, fascists who actively sought to shield Jewish civilians from falling victim to the industrialized slaughter carried out by the Nazis. In fact, much like Nazi Germany's other ally in Japan, who went to some effort to take in Jewish refugees, the Fascist Party did not espouse anti-Semitic beliefs, at least at its inception. Throughout the 1920s and most of the 1930s, many Italian Jews supported the regime, with 171 serving as officers in the armed forces and 279 as officers in the Black Shirt militia. That said, as Rome and Berlin got cozier, in September 1938, Mussolini decreed the first in a series of infamous racial laws, which severely curtailed the rights and personal liberty of Italian Jews. Of the approximately 46,700 Jews living in Italy as of 1938, 7,129 would eventually be arrested. The vast majority of them would be deported to concentration camps in Germany and Poland, and only 1,016 would survive by the end of the war. So, many crimes committed. The Allies knew about many of them, so why didn't the world witness the equivalent of Nuremberg and Tokyo, a large trial bringing to attention and documenting for posterity the scale of those atrocities? As ever, nothing's black and white, and the devil here is in the details. The armistice. So let's start with the Italian armistice of September the 8th, 1943. With this act, the Italian government surrendered to the Allies and continued the war against the Axis as a co-belligerent army alongside Britain, the US, and other Allied forces. As to what all went into this so-called switching of sides, this whole affair would deserve a video of its own. But in brief for now, following Operation Husky, the Allied landings in Sicily on July the 9th, 1943, dissent against Mussolini grew exponentially within the armed forces, the government, and the Fascist Party itself. On July the 25th, during a session of the Fascist Grand Council, party official Dino Grandi launched a motion for Mussolini to be removed and for full powers to be handed over to King Victor Emmanuel III of Savoy. The motion gained a majority within the Grand Council, prompting the king to seize the occasion and arrest the Duce. In the aftermath, Field Marshal Badoglio as his new prime minister. Keep this in mind, Badoglio himself could be held accountable for his fair share of war crimes as Graziani's former superior in the Italo-Ethiopian War. He could also be held accountable for crimes against peace, considering his role as Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces when Italy declared war on France and Britain. However, after weeks of secret negotiations, on September the 3rd, Badoglio's man, General Castellano, signed a secret armistice with US General Walter Bedell Smith. On September the 8th, the agreement was made public, pulling Italy out of the Axis Pact. But then things became messy. Mussolini was freed by German paratroopers on September the 12th with the complicity of fascist hardliners. Thus, the dictator was reinstated as head of a new state, the Italian Social Republic, in control of the northern and central sections of the Italian boot. The king and Badoglio, supported by the Allied expeditionary forces, retained control of the south. Thus, Italy was now embroiled in a civil war layered on top of the larger global conflict that was still raging. On the one side, the Italian Social Republic and German forces deployed to Italy. On the other, the Allies, the co-belligerent Italian troops who had disavowed fascism, plus an aggressive partisan movement which targeted Nazi fascist forces deep inside their territory. As was the case elsewhere in Europe, partisan action was met with brutal reprisals against civilians, enacted by both local fascists and German Nazis. This led to a paradoxical situation. In the setting of a war crimes tribunal, a prospective post-war Italian government could have played the part of both the defendant and the victim. As I said, it's a mess. But it gets even worse. Following the September 8th armistice, Badoglio and US General Eisenhower signed a second agreement on September the 29th, the Instrument of Surrender. According to its Article 29, the new Italian government was obliged to arrest and surrender into the hands of the United Nations to, quote, Benito Mussolini, his chief fascist associates, and all persons suspected of having committed war crimes or analogous offences whose names appear on lists to be communicated by the United Nations and who now or in the future are on territory controlled by the Allied Military Command or by the Italian government. This was all rather awkward, considering that the signatory himself, Marshal Badoglio, could have easily made it onto that list. Nonetheless, shortly afterward, the War Crimes section of the British Foreign Office made a drastic decision. They would bar British authorities from apprehending any individual who had supported the Allied war effort after September 1943. This decision would later be adopted by the combined chiefs of staff. This meant that all Allied forces, not just the Brits, were now expected not to arrest any suspected war criminal, provided they had joined the co-belligerent army or the resistance movement in northern Italy. This was essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for the likes of Badoglio. But how about those staunch fascists still active in the Italian Social Republic? While the desire to punish them was still alive and kicking, especially amongst Italians themselves. The CLN, the National Liberation Committee, overseeing the resistance, had even endorsed a rather radical plan formulated in part by Winston Churchill in late 1943. According to the plan, the United Nations would draft a list of 50 to 100 Italian fascist criminals who could then be executed on the spot without incurring any punishment on the individuals who killed them. It was a nationally sponsored hit list, essentially. No jurisprudence needed. This would be much simpler than involving the courts or allowing for, basic human rights. It's the good guys doing the killing this time, after all. The executed and the forgiven. However, the intricacies of the armistice and the Civil War already showed the signs of Allied ambivalence towards Italian authorities when it came to punishment for crimes. Nonetheless, the Allies were less ambiguous when it came to their war aims. Their armies' advance towards the north of the peninsula was slow but relentless. By April 1945, the German occupation forces were retreating to Austria and the fascist loyalist forces were crumbling. By the 25th of the month, World War II officially ended in Italy, initiating a short yet intense period of trials, executions, and retribution against fascists no longer in power. Benito Mussolini himself and 17 of his top officials were executed by resistance factions on April 28th. More fascist party officials, police commissioners, military leaders, and even regular foot soldiers would be tried and sentenced to death by improvised courts, also set up by the resistance. And although the Italian Civil War had ended, the killings did not. Far left factions within the resistance continued to mete out summary justice against former fascist militias, especially in the infamous Triangle of Death in the Emilia region. The death toll of this lethal wave of revenge is unclear, ranging from 4,500 to 30,000 victims. But it was okay in this case because, again, the people doing it, they were the good guys. On a more formal level, British occupation forces swiftly organised and conducted 40 trials against Italian war criminals. On top of this, Italian pro-Allied authorities also set about to initiate a process of de-fascisation, similar in principle to the process of denazification which the Allies would pursue in Germany and Austria. And you can see our video, How Did Germany Denazify So Quickly After World War II? In this case, the de-fascisation would be carried out by the High Court of Justice for Sanctions Against Fascism and a High Commission. The latter reviewed more than 218,000 cases attributed to almost 35,000 officials and officers. Not bad as a start for a purge. But by February 1946, the High Commission was dissolved and its powers transferred directly to the government. On June 2, 1946, a referendum abolished the Italian monarchy. The new Republican government, featuring a coalition of Christian Democrats and Communists, initiated a strategy of general pacification within Italian society. On June 22nd, Minister of Justice Palmiro Togliatti, who was also Communist Party secretary, issued a general amnesty offered to all those responsible for political and war crimes. There were exceptions, of course. The amnesty would not apply to cases of pillage, torture, murder and massacre. High-ranking officials and military officers would also not benefit from this decree. Togliatti was heavily criticised for this move and in fact resigned 1 month later, but the amnesty remained in effect and applied far broader than its initial intentions. Eventually, out of those 218,000 cases identified by the High Commission, only 738 resulted in a sentence. Therefore, most of those who had committed the worst atrocities on the ground, especially in Yugoslavia, Libya and Ethiopia, still remained unpunished. To try to counter this, Yugoslavia, being the territory with the highest rate of fascist war criminals, its government would file charges against 764 Italian nationals. Unsurprisingly, General Roata was at the very top of the list of criminals compiled by Yugoslavia. And in fact, he had been under Allied custody since early 1945. However, he ultimately got off very lightly thanks to an old entry in his CV. You see, back in the 1930s, Roata had been the chief of the Italian Military Information Service. As such, he had access to information proving that former British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had attempted to keep Mussolini out of the war by offering him some French colonies. Moreover, Roata had later acquired intelligence about Marshal Badoglio's conduct after the September 1943 armistice. Badoglio had failed to issue clear orders to his troops stationed in Rome, thus allowing for the capital to fall into German hands. For both reasons, both British and Italian governments agreed that Roata was likely to reveal embarrassing secrets should he be tried. Thus, as early as March 1945, Roata was able to escape custody with the collaboration of Italian police and British intelligence. The former general thus escaped to Francoist Spain, and after benefiting from the Togliatti amnesty of 1946, he lived as a free man, dying in Rome in 1968. So, Roata got away with it. What about the other 763 criminals in that list? The matter was complicated by the fact that the Italians themselves had been victim to Yugoslav atrocities. In April 1946, new Italian Prime Minister Christian Democrat Alcide De Gasperi denounced these crimes to the Allies, especially the massacres perpetrated by the Foibe, natural sinkholes in the karst region. In the last stages of the war, between 3,000 and 20,000 Italians, including civilians, were thrown alive into the Foibe by Yugoslav partisans. Moreover, De Gasperi warned the Allies that extraditing any Italian national to Yugoslavia would impact the public opinion and likely destabilize the young and fragile Italian democracy. The Prime Minister then reassured all that his government intended to investigate and prosecute war criminals. De Gasperi was still referring to the Italian Commission of Inquiry set up on May 6, 1946. This was a brainchild of his Minister of War, Manlio Brosio, created with the explicit aim of preventing the risks of extraditing Italian nationals to foreign powers. By May 1947, the Commission had identified 39 high-ranking individuals for investigation, appearing to proceed in the right direction. But the initial momentum soon gave way to a slower pace and resources while investigating fascist criminals. The Commission also gathered evidence on anti-Italian massacres in Yugoslavia. The final report to the Italian judiciary was submitted only on June 30th, 1951. By that time, any interest on the Allied side to stage war crimes trials had fizzled away. So, what was the real deal with the Commission of Inquiry? According to a 2006 inquest of the Italian parliament, the commission was never interested in bringing criminals to justice. Shocking, we know, but only as a tool to buy time while the government reinforced its ties with the Western allies. At the same time, the commission would gather evidence about anti-Italian atrocities at the Foibe, which could be used as a case to prevent extraditions to Yugoslavia. And this all worked. From 1946 to 1947, Rome resisted any request from Belgrade to extradite, let alone bring to trial former fascists active in Yugoslavia. Over the same period, the Western Allies were happy not to get involved, so Yugoslav leader Marshal Tito could count only on his Soviet counterpart Joseph Stalin to exert pressure on the Italian government. But by 1948, the two leaders had dramatically broken off relations, which effectively dashed any hope to extradite the likes of the Black Beast to Yugoslavia. Besides Yugoslavia, the Ethiopian government also was pressuring Rome for the trial of several high-ranking officers, including Field Marshals Graziani and Badoglio. Due to the complexities deriving from the September 1943 armistice described earlier, Badoglio would never be tried, a failure to act which had the UK's blessing. As per Graziani, in July 1947, the Italian government informed Ethiopian authorities that he would indeed go to court, but nothing happened for several months. In the interim, diplomatic relations between the two countries had been interrupted, hence Ethiopia could not demand Graziani's extradition. In November 1948, the Ethiopian ambassador in London turned to the British Foreign Secretary Ernst Bevin for help. Bevin replied only in January 1949, bouncing off the hot potato back to Rome. The Ethiopian ambassador should sort the issue out with his Italian counterpart, Mr. Gallerati Scotti. The two ambassadors corresponded in September 1949, but the Italian legate refused to escalate the issue to his minister in Rome. Bevin failed again to intervene, fearing repercussions on the current friendly relations between Britain and Italy. After facing such a barrage of red tape and procedure, the Ethiopian government dropped the last issue, hoping that at least Graziani would be tried in his home country. This didn't happen until 1948. His charges, however, did not include the perpetration of massacres in Ethiopia, nor his responsibility for the horrific camps in Somalia and other African colonies. The officer was in fact charged only for collaborationism on account of his role in the armed forces of the pro-fascist, pro-Nazi state, the Italian Social Republic. Graziani was found guilty and sentenced to 17 years in prison, but the butcher of Addis Ababa was freed after only 2 years thanks to an amnesty. In 1952, he entered the political arena, joining the far-right party Italian Social Movement, or MSI, becoming its honorary president. His appointment lasted until his death in 1955. Intricacies of a peace treaty. So, to recap, Yugoslavia and Ethiopia failed to bring Italian criminals to justice, in part because of the Allies' unwillingness to support them. Western powers simply had an interest in maintaining good relations with their former enemy, as exemplified by the negotiations surrounding the peace treaty with Italy. This would be signed in Paris on February 10, 1947, and it contained Article 45, according to which Italy shall take the necessary steps to ensure the apprehension and surrender for trial of persons accused of having committed, ordered, or abetted war crimes and crimes against peace or humanity. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? Well, actually not really. The enforcement of such an article was watered down by an additional clause. It stated that in case of a disagreement regarding Article 45, the issue could be referred to the ambassadors in Rome of the Soviet Union, UK, US, and France. According to Luigi Prosperi, assistant professor in criminal law at Utrecht University, this provision was the result of a political compromise between the big three on the one hand, UK and US, that were every day less eager to be involved in tracing and arresting the alleged war criminals, fearing the repercussions in the Italian public opinion. On the other, the Soviet Union, the champion of the Yugoslav government's cause. In essence, as of 1947, Moscow was very much willing to bring to justice those responsible for atrocities in Slovenia and Croatia, while the Western Allies were more inclined to secure Italy's friendship, whatever the cost. This was similar to what was happening in Germany in the same years. Nazis dealt with, the West decided that the next enemies in human wartime bingo were the Soviets. And as both Germany and Italy bordered countries in Moscow's sphere of influence, and Italy was now home to one of the strongest, if not the strongest communist and socialist party in Western Europe, the West needed to keep the current Italian government and public on their side, lest they fall into the Soviets' lap. Even with the inclusion of the softening clause, Professor Prosperi states that the Italian authorities received the draft with scorn. According to the Minister of Justice, Fausto Gio, of the Italian Communist Party, the clause was at odds with the Italian nationals' right to liberty, since they would be exposed to every request of surrender, even the most arbitrary. During the Paris Peace Conference, the Italian delegation pushed back for the war crimes clauses. For example, they demanded that any alleged war criminal should not be handed over to the country in which the crimes were committed, and the accused should be offered guarantees of a fair trial. And very importantly, they protested that the individuals most responsible for crimes against peace or humanity had already been tried and often executed by the direct justice of the Italian people. Basically, the point made by the Italian delegation was, not all of us Italians were fascists. Many of us actively fought against them, and we exacted justice by ourselves. Are more trials really needed? In such a complex and delicate situation, UK and US representatives at the Paris conference decided to disengage from the prosecution of Italian war criminals. All they would do would be to put pressure on Rome to cooperate with any other country who may press charges against said criminals. Washington went a step further. On August 14, 1947, the US Department of State issued a declaration in which they formally renounced the application of Article 45. Throughout 1948, the UK, France, and finally Greece also renounced either formally or informally to enforce Article 45. So to sum up, in the end, fascist Italy did not have its own Nuremberg for a variety of complex and overlapping reasons. First of all, the nation had been split in two since 1943, fascists and anti-fascists. The Allies wished to cooperate with the latter faction, even if it included individuals who were undoubtedly deserving to go to trial for various extreme atrocities. Second, the post-war government was able to portray Italians both as perpetrators and victims of atrocities, thus ensuring Allied support or delaying efforts for extradition. Third, similar to what happened in Japan and Germany, post-war tensions with the Soviet bloc prompted the Western Allies to support the Italian government's strategy of reconciliation and pacification. Considering the strength and size of the local Communist Party, the West simply needed the Christian Democrats to stay in power, even if it meant foregoing justice. That said, as alluded to, not every fascist war criminal got off scot-free. The Duce himself and his closest circle of acolytes were executed at the war's end, and Italian authorities and partisan factions did carry out both trials and extrajudicial executions of other fascist officials in the immediate post-war period. This fact actually allowed the government to prevent the Allies from organizing large-scale trial, claiming that justice had already been carried out by the Italian people. Germany and Japan were not dissimilar in the sense that a great deal of wanted criminals did go to court, but massively more got a slap on the wrist, or not even that in some cases. Again, the most egregious of all being the Emperor of Japan himself, who, contrary to popular belief since, largely because of Allied propaganda in his favor, oversaw and ordered things that would make anyone but the likes of Hitler squeamish. Let alone the Emperor's uncle, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, who directly oversaw and was in charge of one of the largest massacres in human history, occurring at Nanjing, seeing upwards of 250,000 civilians slaughtered in a matter of weeks. Bizarrely, it actually would have been massively worse if not for the intervention of a Nazi in the region by the name of John Rabe, who is credited as saving many tens of thousands of lives during the event. Noteworthy, the other individual besides Prince Asaka in charge of the whole thing, Iwane Matsui, was gone for much of this, and upon return and learning what the full extent of what had happened was, tried in vain to put a stop to it, but was quite literally not just ignored, but mocked and laughed by his subcommanders for this. He was more or less forcibly retired in in disgrace, while Prince Asaka, who again was there the entire time and left in charge during Matsui's absence, seemingly had zero issue with it at all. While Matsui was still hardly blameless in all of this, to his credit, after becoming removed from command, he would make a substantial personal donation to a French humanitarian who was working on trying to set up a safety zone for Chinese civilians in Shanghai. He also tried to get improvements made to certain Chinese refugee camps, and on top of that, he commissioned a statue of the Bodhisattva for Mercy, Cannon, and Koa Kannon, Pan-Asian Cannon, in honor of all Chinese and Japanese soldiers dying during the Second Sino-Japanese War. He also subsequently prayed in front of the Koa Kannon in the morning and evening for pretty much the rest of his life, before ultimately being sentenced to death for his part in the massacre. As for the emperor's uncle, Prince Asaka, well, he would state no such massacre ever happened. He also claimed he did not receive any complaints during the occupation about any such behaviors by his army, and nor did he have any knowledge of it. Unlike Matsui, who was sentenced to death, Prince Asaka would not only be protected by, but named by the United States as blameless. He then spent the next 3.5 decades or so apparently mostly playing golf and designing golf courses until his death in 1981. Again, you can check out our 2-hour documentary, Swept Under the Rug: The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, for more details. On May 8, 1945, the German armed forces signed their unconditional surrender to the Allied powers. World War II, at least in Europe, was over. But now that the guns had fallen silent, the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had to face a daunting conundrum: how to deal with the active members of the National Socialist Party, the SS, the Wehrmacht, and other organizations who had committed some rather extreme war crimes and crimes against humanity. On top of that, how to rid the fabric of the fallen Third Reich society from the pernicious influence of an extremist ideology so many had bought into. After all, in some respects, with those who had bought into the ideology wholly, it would have been like going back to the 1700s American South and trying to convince a mass group of slave owners to completely and almost immediately rethink their ideas on slavery and those of African descent in the nation. A seemingly impossible task. And then beyond ideological shifts, just from a practical standpoint, how to speed up economic recovery for the nation and ensure nothing like this would happen again in the country and provide a strong buffer between the Soviets and the rest of Europe. So, how was this all accomplished, and how did they do it so fast, and just how successful was all of this in reality? To begin with, the very top-ranking members of the Nazi Party and Nazi-adjacent organizations, 199 defendants in total, were tried at the famous Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946. Of course, hundreds if not thousands of other officials and officers wanted by Allied authorities were able to escape to Argentina via the numerous rat lines through Scandinavia, Spain, and even Vatican City. And countless more had no need to escape. Entities within the Allied and Soviet forces were more than happy to look the other way about anything they got up to during the war, owing to the knowledge contained in their brains, and we've got more on that in just a little bit. But when looking at the more wide-scale process of denazification of the citizenry, most of these efforts consisted of special tribunals reviewing the alleged Nazi past of German and Austrian citizens, as well as just a general installment in the mass populace that everything that had happened was their fault, and trying to get rid of various works that espoused Nazi ideology. On that latter point, over 30,000 different books were not only banned in the country after the war, but also systematically collected and destroyed. Anyone who tried to keep a copy could face legal consequences. The irony of this was not lost on anyone, given this move was more or less a tactic taken out of the Nazi handbook when they came to power. Beyond this, as alluded to, there was the general populace, who were made to feel responsible for what Germany had done under the Nazi regime, with the Psychological Warfare Division of Supreme Allied Headquarters Expeditionary Force taking point on this. They began efforts here seeing to it that the media, from radio to newspapers, not only strongly emphasized the atrocities in their coverage, but also explicitly noted that it was every single German's fault for allowing it to happen, not just the Nazis. Another rather ironic page taken out of the Nazi handbook, although to be fair, in this case strongly emphasizing educating the German public on all the atrocities that had actually been committed, unlike much of the things were just completely made up by the Nazis. Beyond the various media outlets, posters were put up all around showing pictures from concentration camps with giant text overlaid saying things like, "You are guilty of this." As noted by British author James Stern, in one German town, quote, "A crowd gathered around a series of photographs which, though initially seemed to depict garbage, instead revealed dead human bodies. Each photograph has a heading, 'Who is guilty?' The spectators are silent, appearing hypnotized, and eventually retreat one by one. The placards are later replaced with clearer photographs, and placards proclaiming, 'This town is guilty. You are guilty.'" On top of that, in towns near concentration camps, the citizenry were often made to tour them and even help bury the dead, help dig up mass graves and things like this, with films also being made of this by the American War Information Unit to be shown to Germans who couldn't see for themselves. As noted by the chief of the film division of psychological warfare, Sidney Bernstein, the point of all of this was to, quote, shake and humiliate the Germans and prove to them beyond any possible challenge that these German crimes against humanity were committed and that the German people, and not just the Nazis and SS, bore responsibility. The general shift in mindset to blame all Germans and not just the Nazis began around 1944, with before this generally a distinction being made by the US brass and with the US public, whereas after a strong push to solidify in everyone's minds that there was little difference between a Nazi and a non-Nazi German citizen. This also seems to have been a general mindset pushed by the military brass to their own troops, warning soldiers that, quote, the majority of Germans supported the Nazis, try to make friends with us, to get information, to get favors, to create sympathy for the poor, downtrodden German people, to make us disagree among ourselves, or just to get a good chance to slip a knife into Allied soldiers. Speaking of the soldiers, and going back to taking pages out of the Nazi handbook, it is also noted that during the denazification process, not just on the Soviet side, but on the US side as well, frequent random beatings and rape of German civilians out and about was a thing. As one German professor noted, these assaults have become notorious among the civilian population of Marburg. Nobody risks going out in the evenings, and people feel as if they were exposed to acts of indiscriminate brutality with no means of protection. But in all, to help change the mindset of the German populace who had bought into the Nazi ideology, the general push was to show the atrocities that had been committed and try to make every German citizen feel responsible. Going back to the tribunals to try and punish those more directly involved and rid society of them in any prominent position, very briefly, the objectives of the process were codified as early as July of 1945, and while the tribunal sentences dragged on into 1957, the vast majority of the millions of card-carrying Nazi Party members had already been reviewed and sanctioned by April 1948. But that's all at a very high level. So how was this actually accomplished, and how was it done so quickly? To begin with, the process of removing National Socialism ideology from the social fabric of Germany was conceived long before the end of the war in Europe. In fact, the term denazification itself was coined in 1943 by the Pentagon as they began thinking about what the post-war Germany legal system would look like. And as early as August 1944, this had all gotten expanded, with US President Franklin Roosevelt writing in his memos that the Allies should drive home to the Germans that they had participated in a lawless conspiracy. The same sentiment was expressed more formally when Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. On that occasion, the so-called Three Greats clarified that denazification was to be considered a strategic war aim. More precisely, the removal of all Nazi and militarist influences from public offices and from the cultural and economic life of the German people. The Third Reich surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the drive for denazification was restated in the Potsdam Agreement of August 1945. By that month, the Western Allies had compiled a list of 178,000 Nazis to put under arrest, while the Soviets had already proceeded to the internment of 67,000 Reich officials. Such a huge endeavour could not be conducted willy-nilly, of course. Allied occupation forces had to clearly state the denazification objectives and parameters, as well as the categories and related sanctions for Nazi offenders. According to a US Department of State memo of July 1945, the objectives of the denazification program included A. the arrest of Nazi leaders, supporters, and any other persons dangerous to the Allied occupation or its objectives, B. exclusion of members of the Nazi Party who had been more than nominal participants from both public office and positions of responsibility in private enterprises, C. eradication of Nazi laws and decrees, D. the dissolution of the Nazi Party and all its affiliated organizations, as well as the prevention of their revival, which went hand in hand with E. elimination of all paraphernalia so central to Nazi propaganda, symbols, flags, and anthems, and finally, F. complete removal of Nazi ideology from German information services, schooling system, and religion. Having clarified what denazification was about, Allied forces had to define how it would be carried out. The Allied Control Council reached an agreement only in January 1946, issuing Directive 24, which contained guidelines for a coordinated approach. As we shall see later, this would be anything but coordinated. In each of the 4 occupation zones of Germany, the Allies set up ad hoc denazification commissions and tribunals, which involved the participation of local vetted individuals such as union leaders, judges, and opponents of Nazism. The rulings of these bodies were made on the basis of an extensive 131-point questionnaire drafted by the Public Safety Branch of the Allied military government. This was known as the Fragebogen, which translated from German simply means questionnaire. Respondents had to provide accurate and detailed answers about their education, their professional training, employment, and military service. Going even deeper, those filling in the questionnaire had to provide details on the source of their income and assets since January 1931, as well as their writings and speeches published since 1923. But most of all, they had to provide a full account of their membership and role within the National Socialist Party or any other affiliated organization. In the American occupation sector, filled in and signed questionnaires would be evaluated by a denazification tribunal in collaboration with the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps and a special branch section of the military government's Public Safety Division. These bodies would then cross-check all the answers against police files, civil service records, and the very archives of the Nazi Party. The purpose of this screening was not to identify all German citizens who had joined the party or an adjacent organization at any point, as there would have been very few exceptions. The Allied military government, in fact, agreed to safeguard from sanctions the purely nominal member of the Nazi Party who was forced to join in order to retain his position of livelihood or escape the concentration camp. The point was to ascertain if the individuals under scrutiny had been involved in more than just a nominal capacity in supporting the Nazi regime, if they had contributed to perpetrating war crimes and crimes against humanity, or if they posed a threat to the Allies and the restoration of democracy. Based on these factors, respondents would be classified as follows. Major offenders were to be sentenced to life imprisonment or even to death. Then you had the offenders, activists, militarists, and others who had profited from Germany's war of aggression, who could face up to 10 years in prison. Next, you had the somewhat murkier category of lesser offenders, subjected to a probationary period of up to 3 years. The rank-and-file followers and supporters of Hitler's regime with no specific active responsibilities might encounter a fine and be subject to surveillance. And finally, exonerated individuals would receive no sanction. Based on this categorization, anybody from lesser offender and up were deemed to have had more than a nominal participation in the Nazi Party's activities. As such, in addition to the sanctions described, they would face mandatory removal from their post, be them military officers or public officials. Alright, so we've covered how the denazification of Germany should have worked. But how did it actually turn out? Well, especially in the US-controlled occupation zone, military authorities started with a bang, preemptively detaining 400,000 Germans in internment camps before they had even started filling in their 131-point questionnaires. But when the tribunals and commissions started applying due process, it became apparent that discerning rank-and-file party members from lesser or more serious offenders was no easy task. The US military had access to excellent records. The one thing the Nazis were unquestionably good at was record keeping. Occupation troops in Munich, in fact, discovered the party's entire registry with the names of 12 million card-carrying members. But according to Earl F. Ziemke, writing for the US Army Center of Military History, quote, "It was on the grey fringes of denazification that the question of who and what were Nazis vexed military governments." The military occupation authorities had to sift through all of those 12 million individuals trying to identify the worst that humanity had to offer. And it turns out that many of those 12 million Nazis had training, experience, energy, affability, and not a bad political record. As reported by Ziemke, American troops found those under scrutiny to be, on the whole, surprisingly pleasant chaps, which made their denazification efforts all the more difficult. A US high-ranking officer commented that if all the Nazis had been exceedingly unpleasant and rude, denazification would have been easy. On the other hand, many among those Germans, who were not formal members of the party, could fall into two categories. Those ballsy enough not to fall for Nazi ideology and propaganda, and those who had applied for membership but had been rejected. Interestingly, the former were equally not keen to cooperate with the Allies, and the latter likely did not make for ideal members of society. And that was the problem. Denazification was all well and good, but the Allies were also seeking to rebuild German society from its ruins and as fast as possible. If they made a clean sweep of anybody even loosely associated with National Socialism, in Ziemke's words, they were going to have to run the country with old men until the next generation grew up. The number of political acceptables between the ages of 20 and 50 who were also trained and competent was exceedingly small. So that was the first snag. The second one was that the whole program required a huge bureaucratic apparatus which the Allies simply could not manage. In the US-controlled zone alone, the commissions and tribunals had to review a whopping 10 million questionnaires. Sure, they had enrolled local personnel to run the tribunals, but even so, trained manpower was scarce. And even those Germans who were willing to participate were reluctant to dish out harsh sanctions on their fellow citizens. The third snag was that defendants in these tribunals had found a convenient way out. They could easily obtain signed sworn affidavits from priests or even just from friends and neighbors attesting that the defendant was a mere rank-and-file follower or that he or she could be altogether exonerated. Naturally, a cottage industry emerged, putting these affidavits on sale. They later became colloquially known as Persian, after the popular Persil brand of detergents. In other words, they would leave a defendant's reputation squeaky clean. Eventually, US authorities could not cope with the red tape associated with denazification in their controlled areas, and with tensions rising between the Soviets and the US, their focus also somewhat shifted. In particular, they were now much more concerned with Germany's rapid economic recovery, rather than trying to make sure everyone paid for their crimes and weren't allowed to be in prominent positions. A similar thing happened over in Japan with the now termed reverse course policies. But back in Germany, with this shift on March 5, 1946, they formally transferred all such duties to reconstituted German authorities, something that the British had done a few months earlier as well. On that note, with the British and French occupation zones, local military governments took an even more pragmatic approach. Both prioritized the efficiency of local administration and economy to quickly cope with housing and food shortages. Thus, they were even less scrupulous when it came to allowing former high-ranking officials to hold or resume important positions. French authorities were most lax of all, even allowing Nazis residing in other zones to move and resume work in their occupied areas with no hindrance. As another example, given the Nazis had placed individuals whose beliefs aligned with their ideologies in prominent teaching positions, around 3/4 of teachers in the country were immediately fired after the war, only for the vast majority in the French zone to be quickly rehired and given their positions back. This was reflected in most industries in the French zone. In the end, in total, the French only labelled 13 total individuals in their region as major offenders. Finally, moving to the Soviet occupation zone, the removal of Nazi personnel and ideology appeared to be more resolute than in the zones governed by the Western Allies. In fact, denazification proceeded hand in hand with the Sovietization of Eastern Germany, that is, extensive land reforms and nationalization of industry. Moreover, while Western allies strove to replace Nazi officials with political representatives from a broad spectrum, Moscow had a preference for the KPD, or Communist Party of Germany, later the Socialist United Party, or SED. However, according to historian Timothy R. Vaught, the denazification in the Soviet-held area was not as thorough as it initially appeared. Thanks to the cooperation of the KPD, Soviet authorities were able to delegate most denazification processes to the Germans themselves in the form of local anti-Nazi committees and newly formed provincial governments. These bodies enacted their measures inconsistently and were prone to caving in when meeting local resistance and objections. Moreover, they appeared to follow the general principle that if former Nazis were willing to rebrand themselves as communists, they would not be removed from public life. As you might have guessed from all of this, as early as 1948, it had become apparent that the denazification of Germany had not resulted in the intended restructure of society. In December of that year, international relations scholar John H. Herz, a member of the US delegation at the Nuremberg trials, published an article with the self-explanatory title of The Fiasco of Denazification in Germany. Herz focused on the American occupation zone, reporting how trials conducted there were frequently hindered by intimidation on the part of Nazi sympathizers. Even without intimidation, prosecutors based their indictments of the answers provided in the questionnaire without verifying their veracity. Thus, most defendants were categorized as mere followers. Moreover, after denazification efforts had been handed over to German authorities in March 1946, they had issued 2 amnesties, one in August, one in December, exonerating members of the Hitler Youth, persons of low income, and disabled citizens. Herz pointed out how such amnesties allowed even war criminals to escape prosecution. The scholar also unearthed a major procedural flaw. Until October 1947, denazification processes had vetted some 50,000 individuals a month, which is quite a good number, but the tribunals had given precedence to those who had been classified as followers on the basis of their questionnaire. By the time the tribunals finally worked their stash of paperwork to those classified as offenders, a legislative amendment allowed prosecutors to recategorize them as followers, with the exception of members of the SS. Such recategorization still required approval from the Allied military government, but in January 1948 this procedural step was removed by the enactment of an expediting procedure. Now, all offenders could be rubber-stamped as followers wholesale. A further relaxation of standards took place in March of 1948, with the almost total removal of the exception clause for members of the SS and other criminal organizations affiliated to the Nazi Party. Now, only those belonging to the category of the major offenders could expect major sanctions. Everybody else was deemed a follower and was free to go after paying a fine. As for the numbers on all of this, some 12,753,000 Germans were expected to undergo the denazification procedure. More than 9 million were found not chargeable. The remaining 3.2 million were processed by the end of April 1948, and of these, more than 2.3 million were amnestied without trial. That left 836,000 to be tried, a mere 6.5%. More than 1/3 of these were exonerated, and more than half were classified as followers. Of the remainder, 10.7% were classed as lesser offenders, 2.1% were Class 2 offenders, and only 0.1% were found to be major offenders. That's 836 individuals from the nearly 13 million person pool. And even those who were sentenced as offenders in any degree of severity, most received lenient sanctions such as community work, payment of fines, or short prison sentences. Herz proceeded to compile several examples of such lenient treatments, of which we shall report only a few. An active propagandist and publisher of anti-Semitic writings was ranked as a follower and fined a mere 50 marks. A dean at Bonn University, active member of the SS and their intelligence services, the SD, was fully exonerated. A high-ranking member of the Gestapo was found to only be a follower and received a minor fine. Another Gestapo man, head of a station in the town of Fulda, was also a follower. And the former deputy chief of police in Nuremberg, and one of the men responsible for the infamous Kristallnacht, also a follower, and fined 800 marks. One physician, responsible for carrying out the sterilization law against undesirables, well, you guessed it, he was just a follower. Please pay your 500 marks and then leave. Finally, an aeronautical engineer and industrialist who made a fortune of 36 million marks thanks to slave labor, well, you get the gist by now, he was fined 2,000 marks. Moving on toward the end of the 1940s, across all areas of occupation, leniency gave way to amnesty and a strategy of integration. The chief proponent of this approach was the first chancellor of the new Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, Konrad Adenauer. After his election in September 1949, Adenauer advocated for West Germany to forge strong bonds with Western Europe against the communist bloc. This strategy also included for old Nazi cadres to be integrated into the new republic in order to move forward. Towards that end in all this, in May 1951, Adenauer's government passed the first amnesty law, which reintegrated into their position some 150,000 officials and civil servants previously removed by the Allied denazification efforts. The following year, the Chancellor reported to the Parliament that 2/3 of German diplomats were in fact former Nazis. The armed forces, security services, and even the private sector were similarly replete with former Reich personnel. Sir Ivo Kirkpatrick, British High Commissioner in Germany, commented, "Whenever I travelled, I ran into ghosts of Hitler's Reich, men who had occupied positions in the administration, in industry, or the society of the day. They were either living in retirement or were taking jobs in banks, commerce, or industry." Despite the amnesty, Adenauer's regime also took steps the other way. For example, in August of 1952, his cabinet banned the neo-Nazi Socialist Reich Party, and in September he agreed to pay the State of Israel reparation of 3 billion German marks, the equivalent of $8.3 billion in today's value. But Adenauer's intention was to leave the past behind nonetheless, and in 1954 his government issued the second amnesty law, which this time benefited around 400,000 German citizens. A similar denazification process, culminating in widespread amnesty, was followed in Austria. This country is often excluded from English-speaking accounts of denazification, but we should not forget that Austria was annexed to the Third Reich before the start of World War II, nor that Austrian citizens actively joined the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Nazi Party, and therefore the country was occupied by the Allies at the end of the conflict. The Austrian denazification process was led by the four occupying powers, the UK, France, US, and USSR, in collaboration with three local parties, the Social Democratic Party, the Austrian People's Party, and the Communist Party. According to historian Dieter Stiefel, the Austrian denazification can be divided into 5 phases. During the military security phase from April 1945 to June 1945, the 4 Allied occupation powers worked in coordination to intern an initial batch of prominent SS and Nazi Party members. Such potentially dangerous individuals were hunted down and detained on the basis of blacklists compiled by the Allied High Commissioners. The next phase, from June 1945 to February 1946, is labelled as autonomous denazification. Now, the 4 Allies plus the Austrian government carried out denazification efforts independently from each other, which resulted in contradictory measures and decisions. For example, the US occupation used a 7-page questionnaire similar to the Fragebogen. The British and French used it too, but only in part, while the Soviets ditched it completely. In fact, the Soviets acted relatively chill in their zone of occupation, delegating the denazification process to local authorities. They intervened directly only when they identified someone guilty of war crimes committed on Soviet soil, or when they selected a promising scientist for, let's say, a relocation under pressure. And again, more on that later. In February 1946, the Allies devolved all denazification activities to the Austrian government, ushering in the third autochthonous phase. Local authorities followed 3 laws promulgated to this purpose: the Prohibition Act, the Economic Cleansing Act, and the War Crimes Act. In order to enforce these laws, the government created ad hoc people's courts consisting of 2 professional judges and 3 lay judges nominated amongst the general public. These tribunals were set up to take very direct action, as no appeal was allowed against their verdicts. Nonetheless, Allied authorities took note that the Austrian judiciary introduced it at a very slow pace and pressured for a quicker uptake. In February 1947, the government issued a new National Socialist law regulating the removal of the old Reich's vestiges, thus kicking off the fourth phase, which lasted less than 1 year. The fifth and final phase, from 1948 to 1957, is known as the Time of Amnesties. The first of these involved the so-called Minder Bella Stata, which can be translated as lesser incriminated or lesser offenders. This amnesty was applied to 90% of all registered members of the Austrian National Socialist Party. The Minder Bella Stata amnesty effectively put an end to all major attempts at denazifying Austrian society, which is not surprising. Much like in a divided Germany, after the onset of the Cold War, each Allied power sought to consolidate local authorities under their sphere of influence. The Austrian People's Courts, however, continued to operate until December 1955. Up to that point, these tribunals had issued 13,607 guilty verdicts, but following the withdrawal of occupation forces from the country, a new constitutional law abolished the People's Courts, transferring their duties to standard jury trials. Denazification trials continued for another couple of years, but to a much lesser degree of intensity. In the 1956 to 1957 period, Austrian courts issued a total of 39 verdicts, of which only 18 were guilty sentences. As the denazification efforts and fervor whittled down, the Austrian parliament voted in favor of a final amnesty in 1957. Besides widespread amnesties, it's no secret that hundreds of former Nazi officials entirely escaped from sanctions thanks to their military, scientific, or technical expertise. They were simply deemed too useful to the Allies. In Allied countries, this seems to be something history paints as completely acceptable, though when other countries like Argentina essentially did the same thing, it's more vilified for various reasons. You can see our video, Why Did So Many Nazis Choose to Go to Argentina After World War II, for more on that. But as for the United States, according to the US Nazi War Criminal Records Intra-Agency Working Group, as early as May 10, 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff advised the commander of US forces in Europe, General Eisenhower, to make some exceptions when it came to arresting war criminals. Quoting, "In your discretion, you may make such exceptions as you deem advisable for intelligence and other military reasons." Throughout the summer of 1945, the US Army Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, did employ former German military and intelligence officers as informants. But this was a necessity to identify more dangerous Nazi criminals or suppress anti-Allied resistance. But as friction mounted across the Iron Curtain, American and other Western Allied services took to using German military personnel as a source of intelligence about Soviet military strategy, equipment, and tactics. Toward this end, the CIC collaborated closely with General Reinhard Gehlen, former head of the Foreign Armies East, founded in 1938 and responsible for collecting intelligence on the Soviet Union. But the Corps also recruited personnel whose resumes erred on the criminal side, such as SS officer Klaus Barbie, charmingly known as the Butcher of Lyon. Barbie the Butcher and other war criminals were eventually protected from prosecution and smuggled out of Europe with the complicity of the CIC, OSS, and other Allied services. Many more former Nazi and SS officials would escape via rat lines set up by Argentinian intelligence and even the Vatican. The US Joint Chief of Staffs, however, were not interested in simply knowing more about the Soviets. They were interested in gaining a technological edge over them. As early as July 1945, they explicitly authorized a program to exploit chosen rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use. Those rare minds were 350 German and Austrian scientists and technicians to be brought immediately to America under Operation Overcast. By 1946, the Department of Defense's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency sought to expand Overcast to recruit a further 1,000 former enemy brains and even grant them American citizenship. This was a complicated endeavor, as some of those chosen 1,000 were high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. At least one of them, rocket scientist Werner von Braun, had been an SS officer. The plan required presidential blessing, which President Truman granted in September 1946, insisting that only so-called nominal Nazis should be allowed in the program. The term indicated German and Austrian citizens who had joined the party out of convenience or coercion, but had not actively supported the Reich. The new expanded program took the name of Operation Paperclip. In early 1947, a panel constituted by the Departments of Justice and State began combing dossiers of prospective scientists for relocation to the US, which were based on CIC investigations. The panel initially rejected several applications as the individuals in question had been identified as potential threats on the basis of their Nazi past. This did not sit well with the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. According to the Nazi War Criminal Records Intra-Agency Working Group, they ordered American intelligence in Europe to revise the scientists' dossiers so that they could make it through the paperclip panel. Thus, from 1945 to 1955, Operations Overcast and Paperclip helped relocate 765 scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. The Interagency Working Group estimates that as many as 80% of them were former Nazi Party members. Now, Operation Paperclip is a well-known episode of the Cold War. What is less well-known is that the Soviet Union had their own version of this project, known as Operation Ozoaveachim, or the forced relocation of more than 2,500 German scientists to the USSR. However, an interesting thing about the name is that it's actually a misnomer. The term Ozoaveachim is an acronym which stands for Union of Societies for Assistance to Defense and Aviation Chemical Construction of the USSR. This was a paramilitary and sporting organization founded in 1927. It had absolutely nothing to do with the Soviet equivalent of paperclip, but apparently a German radio incorrectly used this word to refer to the brain drain in 1946, and US intelligence services adopted the term. The plan was initiated in April 1946 when the Soviet Minister of Aeronautical Industry, Mikhail Khrushchev, issued an order for the relocation of the German aeronautical and engine industry. This was followed by a May 13, 1946 resolution decreed by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or MBD, which ordered the transfer of 2,000 German specialists by the end of the year. And not just specialists of any kind, the Soviet zone of occupation included facilities which were replete with scientists and technicians involved in aviation and rocket engineering projects. Initially, the Soviets founded institutions such as the Nordhausen Institute or the Berlin Institute to resume work initiated by the Reich's best and brightest. For example, the Nordhausen was put under the direction of Helmut Gottschalk, a former collaborator of Werner von Braun on the V2 program. But the agreement signed amongst the Allies at the Potsdam Conference prohibited the development of weapons on German soil, and so Moscow planned the relocation of these programs elsewhere. Following the MVD's resolution of May 1946, the Soviet forces started to gather hundreds of experts in atomic research, electronics, navigation equipment, rockets, jet engines, and even color video. On October 22, 1946, Operation Ozoaveachim was effectively initiated, under the leadership of Ivan Serov, later a chairman of the KGB. By day, Serov had organized 92 freight trains transporting the necessary equipment to the USSR, and by night, the army and MVD police swooped in to arrest the German scientists and their families for a total of 6,500 individuals. After being made to see that their lives would be much better doing what the Soviet regime wanted, and it would be a shame if anything happened to themselves or their families, they were offered a regular contract and paid salaries which were higher than that of their Soviet counterparts. As you might imagine, only a fraction of the German scientific contingent refused to cooperate with Moscow, and those that refused were interned at a gulag. The Ozoaveachim scientists were gradually allowed to return to Germany after 1950, with the vast majority leaving after Stalin's death in March 1943. But in the end, at the start of this video, we asked the question, how did Germany and Austria denazify so quickly after World War II? Especially given that the ideology behind their former regime was so embedded into every facet of society. To sum up, on one hand, we can very simplistically state that both societies needed to move on quickly, to both rebuild their economies and to face the political challenges posed by the Cold War. And so everyone was incentivized to do so, and so did. And on top of this, the extreme atrocities committed by the Nazis during the war helped convince those who had bought into what the Nazis were selling that maybe they should rethink their decision-making paradigm. On the other hand, we can cynically acknowledge that the process was quick because it failed overall on a huge percentage of what it was meant to accomplish. Wiping the slate clean in such a perversive regime was a logistically daunting task, one which the Allies and the local institutions were ill-prepared and little motivated to accomplish at a certain point. The Nazi Party was finished, the Soviets were the new threat. West Germany, much like Japan, needed to be strong to help counter this, and to help facilitate this, former prominent Nazis and many prominent individuals in Japan would better serve those goals in their positions that they were experts in, rather than sitting in prison or executed.
The American Revolution is one of the historical events that, together with things like the French Revolution among other things, helped usher in the modern era. The Americans, on the whole, tend to be proud of this event and focus on it heavily in their school curriculum, as it heralds the birth of their nation and the triumph of a handful of terrorists against their government and fellow countrymen. But what do schools in Britain have to say about the American Revolution? To begin with, on the surface, if one talks to people on the street or reads a British book on the subject, Americans will perhaps be positively surprised to see that today there are no hard feelings in England regarding the Americans' choice to leave the glorious British Empire. May it reign forever. But really, we don't care. It seems like a peachy divorce with no grudges held or hostile views taken. After all, for the last century at least, the UK has been the closest ally of the US in Europe, with mutual support in all major conflicts conflicts of the 20th century, and both follow similar policies so consistently that the UK has, on occasion, been ironically referred to as the 52nd state. But there is a catch. While the American Revolution is a cornerstone of American history, in Britain, well, it seems that the subject of the American War of Independence, as it is known in the UK, is rarely mentioned in British education books of past and present, or at least not in any great detail. That's not to say it's not mentioned anywhere, simply that while they may learn a little about early American history, including the War of Independence, it's more of a footnote in British history. It's probably also worth is never seen from a nationalistic point of view. For example, we don't angrily shake our fists at a picture of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Rather, it's covered frankly, and then we move on swiftly to more interesting and relevant subjects to British history. For example, the focus in history is much more centered around things like the Roman times, for example, the legendary resistance of Queen Boudicca against the might of Rome, or later periods such as the 100 Years' War and the intrigues of the Tudors generally trying to keep track of all the beheadings in the Tower of London. In more modern times, emphasis is put on issues such as industrialization, colonialism, and the post-colonization era, as well as the events during the World Wars and internal reforms. As to the aggression of the British Empire, while many certainly complain that it's not fully represented, it is far from omitted. British imperialism, for example, in Africa, is of course addressed. So why not focus on the American War of Independence and the birth of one of the most influential nations in modern history? It seems that the lack of details when teaching about American independence is not due to shame, envy, or part of a continuous effort to hide the UK's colonial past, as, say, the case might be in Japan. Rather, the main reason is the unspectacularly trivial fact that the American Revolution is seen as a minor detail in comparison to other events directly related to British history. The US breaking off was simply just one of many nations that did it for a whole lot of reasons. Indeed, if one looks at the larger scope, more than 60 countries celebrate independence from the British Empire, which in its heyday had control over 1/5 of the globe's population. That would amount to, on average, one Independence Day celebration of a country every week in a given school year. A phlegmatic English answer would be to say that we have better things to focus on than every country's Independence Day. So, the American Revolution is equated with other similar events, and it is rather addressed as an armed uprising of an important but distant rural populace against taxes, so hardly unique in history. The importance of ideas such as enlightenment, freedom, and democratic values are viewed by Americans on the basis of their revolution as one prime example thereof, but the schools in the UK, similar to most European countries, focus on other incidents. Some of them are closer to home and widely acknowledged as shaping history, such as the French Revolution. Another example is the post-colonialism era in Asia and Africa as one of the main facets of world history. These, rather than American independence, are considered to provide the historical depth necessary for such discussions in the UK classrooms. Thus, the War of American Independence will most likely come up as an addendum, providing context when dealing with the French Revolution or with trade regulations within the British Empire as an example of a taxation policy gone wrong. It can also be related to the long-term effects of the 7 Years' War, which may be considered one of the causes that would eventually lead to the higher taxation that in turn ignited the revolutionary actions in the Americas. Of course, that does not mean that American history is shunned from British schools. Far from it. The developments of civic rights, the role of American industrialization, and the combined efforts with the British in the World Wars and the Cold War are placed highly in various stages of the curriculum, be it in the early key stages of the English system or adapted for older students of 15 to 18 years, such as during the A-level and GCSE exams. To give an example within the history books provided by AQA, that's a blast from the past. Out of more than 30 titles covering the period from the Crusades up to the 21st century, two refer directly to the USA. The Making of a Superpower, USA, 1865 to 1975, and The American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980. The titles are indicative of the thematic stressed in each book. Notice that there is no book specifically dealing with the USA before 1861. Besides these reasons, the lack of emphasis on the American Revolution could be seen as related to the political scene within the UK itself. The UK is regarded by some as a fragile nation, as emphasized by much talk of independence by individual regions, especially in the last decade. The independence of a mainly English-speaking American colony, which is also culturally related to England, is much more on par with the Scottish or North Irish independence movements than, say, the Indian independence of 1947. But to sum up, in general, the American Revolution is not negatively portrayed in British schools tools as some might first assume. Rather, it is seen as one of many world history events which are linked to the understanding and teaching of UK history without being particularly vital to it, and thus not really worth covering in depth. And I'll just add on a personal note here that when we started doing this series of how is so-and-so taught in another part of the world, someone asked me this on Twitter, and my response is it's just not taught. We don't really look at it. And, well, now you've had the more in-depth answer. Let's get into today's bonus fact. Ever wonder what the difference between the UK, England, and Great Britain is? Honestly, yes, sometimes, even as a British man. The actual name of the sovereign state we are talking about here is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the UK. The United Kingdom is made up of the countries England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The confusion of the terms seems to revolve around the term country and the political powers that are perceived based on that word. While the four countries that make up the UK are generally considered separate in the minds of locals, and in certain sporting events, their powers for local law and control are devolved from the UK. Think of the 50 states of the United States. While each state has their own set of laws, they are all under the power of the federal government. In the case of the UK, it is somewhat similar, though certain responsibilities are also implied, like healthcare and education, that are delegated to 3 of the 4 countries. The responsibilities that are delegated differ from one country to the next. England is the only country in which the UK does not devolve any powers, and instead it is legislated directly by the UK government. When it comes to international politics, it is the sovereign nation of the UK that is recognised, and not any of the 4 constituent countries. The term Great Britain refers to the landmass that comprises England, Scotland, and Wales. Something that aids in the confusion as to the difference between Great Britain and the UK is that the term is sometimes internationally used as a synonym for the UK. For instance, the UK's Olympic team competes under the name Great Britain, and the ISO, International Organization for Standardization, gives the UK the country codes of GB and GBR. This can be confusing given that the ISO also codes England, Scotland, and Wales as subdivision countries of the UK, but Northern Ireland as a subdivision province. If you're getting the impression that Northern Ireland is the red-headed stepchild of the UK, you may be right, both figuratively and literally, we suppose. The confusion over the definition of these 4 countries in reference to the UK is further muddied up in sporting competitions. There are several international sporting events like the Commonwealth Games and football competitions in which each of the 4 has their own team, and they do not compete under a unified national team. When competing under these conditions, their nations are referred to as home nations. Because each team is from a specific home country, it can lead some to think that these countries have political autonomy as well. If you're curious about when these unions between the countries that comprise the UK came about, it happened as follows. England and Wales were joined in 1536. Scotland and England were joined together in 1707, along with the previously joined Wales, to officially form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ireland decided to join up in 1801, at which point the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was formed. In 1922, however, many of the southern counties of Ireland decided to remove themselves from the Union, and the UK changed their name to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, in summary, Great Britain is England, Scotland, and Wales. The UK is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the full name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. England is just the part of the island that is England. The Crusades are seen as a milestone in European history. Especially through romanticizing eyes, they are often viewed as a heroic age with legendary tales of pious folk, honor-bound knights, and even epic narratives imbued with mystic and semi-mythological elements such as the search for the Holy Grail. Modern historians, however, tend to view the Crusades more than a little less romantically. For example, viewed more as the Pope's political maneuvering to establish power via the policy of the Milites Christi, and in the early going, from a very practical standpoint, simply a way to give various knights causing problems on the home front something to do and in a far-off land. The events are considered as a precursor to the eras of exploration and colonialism, respectively, as the Crusades were an early instance of the effort to deal with the overpopulation of Europe by trying to establish colonies. Furthermore, the failure of the eastward expansion and the related blockage of the routes to the eastern markets would gradually encourage the search for indirect ways to the east by circumnavigating Africa, or most famously since Columbus, by going westwards in search of India. Negative aspects are pointed out, like the massacres of local citizens, such as in Antioch and Jerusalem, regardless of whether they were Christians or Muslims. But even under the light of this revisionism, the view of the cultural superiority of the Europeans is sometimes still present in popular culture. One example is the 2005 movie Kingdom of Heaven, in which Orlando Bloom arrives as a crusader at an estate in Palestine and goes on instructing the locals in canalization techniques, as if the cultures of the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture was born, were waiting for the Crusaders to learn how to turn an arid land into a fertile one. At this point, the question might occur what the Muslim or Arab perspective is towards the Crusader era, but it's a difficult one to answer. Depending on in which decade and in which country one is born, a student will receive different information regarding the Crusades. The reason is that the event is highly politicized today. A common ground, however, is that the Western Christians are viewed as barbarians and unaware of the most elementary rules of honor, dignity, and social ethics. What will differ is where the teaching focuses and to what extent the event is taught at all, which is related to the region, era, and the political atmosphere. This can be seen by works targeted towards the Western public, where two main themes arise. In the first, represented by Amin Mamlouf's 1983 book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, the events are viewed as a general clash of Western and Eastern culture. The second is represented by an Al Jazeera documentary series of 2016, The Crusades in Arab Perspective, where the theme of Christianity versus Islam is particularly highlighted. So let's now talk about schools. The school textbooks in Arab countries are generally regulated by a government institution, such as the Ministry of Education of each country. As an internal matter, the books will deviate from one another, but one can observe similarities indicating a certain alignment, at least regarding some aspects. This was more observable, especially in the second half of the 20th century, influenced by the policy of Pan-Arabism, which was promoted in history and literature disciplines. Nowadays, a concentration on the political unity within each country is mostly the norm, which can cause further deviation between the Arab countries. Regarding the Crusades, pupils get their information out of history and social studies textbooks and even literature. But the way this is done and the school year in which this period is presented differs from country to country. As analytically presented in 2008 in an article by Jörg Dietermann, in Egypt, students learn about the Crusades in their 5th and 11th year. In Jordan, in the 6th year, 7th in Palestine, 8th in Syria, Lebanon, and Libya, 8th and 11th year in Saudi Arabia, and 8th and 10th in Tunisia. The most analytical discussions can be found in textbooks of Palestine and Lebanon, which is to be expected of the areas directly affected the most during the Crusades, though the perspective of modern politics also plays a part. The schoolbooks usually describe the medieval Crusades after having discussed the history of the preceding centuries. In the case of Palestine and Tunisia, descriptions of Europe in the Middle Ages come before those of the Crusades, a fact that helps contextualize and introduce this foreign Western force. The narratives of the Crusades themselves, as told by the Arabic textbooks, concentrate on the events in Greater Syria and Egypt between 1096 and 1291 and stress the military elements. Only in a few countries, such as Palestine, elements of administration and social structures within the Crusader states are described. Overall, the negative evaluation of the invading forces can be seen in the term purification, with which the textbooks in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Libya refer to the final expulsion of the Crusaders. To understand this sentiment and why within the collective memory of modern Arab countries the Crusades are perceived in this way, one should take a closer look at the details of what is being taught. First, we'll start with the presentation of the Crusaders. The Muslims, unlike the Christians, did not regard the individual Crusades as something separate and distinctive, nor did they, at least in the past, single out the Crusaders from the long series of infidel enemies whom they fought in those times. The chroniclers report in detail the smallest skirmishes between Muslims and Frankish troops, but they have little to say about the internal affairs of the Frankish states in the Levant and even less about their countries of origin. Generally, the Arabic point of view on the Crusaders is that of a foreign entity, collectively referred to as Farange or Farang, ignoring the various ethnic differences between them. The term Farange is a derivative of Frank, which was one of the main ethnic groups during the Crusades. The insertion of a vowel between the two letters of the word Frank is indicative of the adaptation of foreign terms, as in Arabic no word can start with a double consonant. This is indicative of the fact that at the time, as well as today, the Crusaders were and are viewed as a collective enemy group, just one amongst the many foreign menaces that their region had to deal with in the late medieval period. Indeed, in the school systems of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Libya, the Crusades are usually treated alongside the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. In the case of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Libya, descriptions of the Mamluk and Ottoman periods follow thereafter. The often implied link with the West's later colonialism can also be seen on many levels. One of them is that in the Saudi Arabian and Egyptian textbooks, the Crusades and Mongol attacks are directly followed by Western assaults and the colonization of Arab countries in modern times. This brings us to the timeline of the Crusades, which focuses on the main themes as taught by history books in Arab countries. The main force of the First Crusade arrived in northern Syria in 1097 after successfully piercing through Asia Minor, despite the resistance of the Seljuk Sultan Khalid Arslan, who controlled parts of the region. In June 1098, the Crusaders gained entry into the lower city of Antioch after an 8-month siege, massacring most inhabitants, including local Christians. In 1098, Kaboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, led the first coordinated attack against the Crusader army, at the time besieging Antioch, and would have possibly managed to end the First Crusade right then and there had he not wasted time besieging Edessa, the easternmost city occupied by the Crusaders. Indeed, he arrived at Antioch on the 7th of June, only 3 days after the Crusaders under Bohemond had entered the outer walls and thus escaped a direct attack on the open field. After this attempt, no coordinated effort was undertaken to face the Crusades. Instead, each local government faced the invaders in turn and mostly on their own. This is seen as a major issue, as the textbooks of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Libya account to a general weakness or fragmentation of the Arab world in this period. They do not shy from making parallels to today's political situation. One reason for this fragmentation was that at the time the control of the armies was assigned to Turkish generals, while the Caliph of Baghdad was becoming more and more a cosmetic and symbolic figurehead. Real political and military power within the territories claimed by the Caliph was exercised by the Turkish Sultan. According to Muslim political theorists, the Sultan was the executive servant and defender of the Caliph. In practice, he ran the caliphate. The Sultan additionally delegated power to various generals, each of whom was more interested in protecting his own dominion. The situation was similar to the late Roman Empire, with the rise of Illyrian generals around the 300s, and especially the Germanic generals, such as the Vandals, Stilicho, who in the early 5th century ruled the Western Roman Empire in all but name. These were seen as foreign by the empire's inhabitants, who built their collective identity out of their tradition of Romance and Greek languages. In August 1099, after the fall of Jerusalem, al-Harari, the chief Qadi of Damascus and famous scholar, went to Baghdad to put pressure on the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustajir Billah to send an army to help the Muslims against the Crusaders. However, Baghdad was a long way from Jerusalem, and moreover, al-Mustajir had no troops to speak of, as he did not hold actual power. Al-Harari's visit to Baghdad is memorable, however, for the sermon that he held in the Great Mosque in Baghdad. Your brothers in Syria have no homes other than the saddles of their camels or the entrails of vultures. Al-Harawi was surrounded by a throng of Syrian and Palestine refugees who wept as he spoke, and their weeping made others in turn weep. The speech is often repeated in classrooms and was, and still is, politicized within the discussion of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. More recently, it has been used in reference to the civil wars in Iraq and Syria, where each faction uses it to target the other by accusing them of collaborating with Westerners. The next milestone in the timeline is the events of Ma'arat en Numan in December 1098, where, after a siege, the Crusaders not only massacred the inhabitants, but also partook in acts of cannibalism. As seen in letters written by Crusaders, a terrible famine racked the army in Ma'ara and placed it in the cruel necessity of feeding itself upon the bodies of the Saracens. The event is further documented by sources such as Fulcher of Chartres, a priest participating in the First Crusade, who reports in horror, "I shudder to tell that many of our people, harassed by the madness of excessive hunger, cut pieces from the buttocks of the Saracens already dead there, which they cooked, but when it was not yet roasted enough by the fire, they devoured it with savage mouth." Among the European records of the incident was the French poem The Ligue of Antioch, which contains an effort to justify this atrocity. The poem contains the following lines uttered by the hermit Peter answering a group of hungry soldiers. But Peter answered, "Out, ye drones, a helpless pack that cry, while all unburied round about the slaughtered Paynim, pagans, lie. A dainty dish is Panyim flesh with salt and roasting dew." This is indicative of the main ideology of the Crusaders, which removed the guilt of massacring the local populace, namely that the assaulted were not Christians and thus could be treated as subhumans. The Eastern authors, unlike some Western ones, tend to view this event of cannibalism not as much as a necessity of hunger, but rather that of religious fanaticism. It is therefore linked with the rest of the horrible acts caused by the Crusaders' view of their enemies as beasts. The development of this ideology is linked with 11th century papal reforms such as the Gregorian reforms that slowly promoted the idea of the Holy War when it had a justified reason, or iustus finis. This helped redefine the term Miletis Christi, which had previously applied to monks exclusively, with spiritual undertones to concern laymen fighting with material weapons on behalf of the church's interest. This concluded a centuries-long evolution of ecclesiastical dogma which goes back to St. Augustine, thus bridging the gap between the pacifism of early Christians and the Holy War of the Crusades. For the scope of this video, suffice it to say that the war was reframed, seen not only justifiable but as an outright duty of Christian piety. Pope Urban II's desire to redirect Christian violence against foreign rather than domestic foes is evident in his address at the Council of Clermont in 1095 that ignited the Crusades. He right out stated that killing infidels was not immoral but rather encouraged, as the participation in the Holy War would serve as penance and remission of sins. The Crusaders were thus animated to destroy that vile race from the Holy Lands because Christ commands it. Another example is the rule of the Templars established in 1128 to 1129 at the Council of Troyes, which stated their goal to defend the lands from the unbelieving pagans that are the enemies of Christ, and as such may be killed without sinning. This ideology is one of many instances where an enemy is portrayed as subhuman, which, as in similar cases throughout world history, encourages atrocities that should be seen from the perspective of fanaticism rather than just the inevitable effects of war. Indeed, the Crusaders continued acting on this, as on July 15th, 1099, Crusaders seized and sacked the city of Jerusalem and massacred Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews alike. The slaughter was shocking even for medieval standards. Almost all school manuals in the Middle East emphasize this massacre, especially in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Libya. An Egyptian book describes it as follows: "When the Crusaders captured the city, they committed many atrocities and permitted the killing of Muslims, Jews, and Christians who held beliefs different from theirs, including men, women, and children who were there. These attackers were not frightened by the holiness of the Aqsa Mosque, and they violated its holiness and killed all Muslims who took refuge in it." As is to be expected, these events produced shockwaves then and still influence the view of the Crusades heavily today. They established the image of the ferocious and barbarian Phalange. The incident at Ma'arat al-Numan in particular gave birth to the epithet cannibal that many modern authors use. Adding to the cynicism of it all, many Eastern Christians were killed alongside their Muslim neighbors. Maybe the Crusaders were too busy being swept up by blood rush to feel like asking the particular faith of the people at their mercy. In any case, at the time, the locals of all faiths suffered the same. The next major milestone is the events during the reign of Salah al-Din, who captured Jerusalem in the aftermath of the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and his subsequent clash with Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade, which marks the end of the strong Crusader states. In the Arabic textbooks, his reign is portrayed as a golden era. He is regarded as a role model, especially in regards to chivalry. The textbooks of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt emphasize that Saladin treated the inhabitants of Jerusalem well, in contrast to the Crusaders' conduct during their conquest of the town. For example, the Jordanian textbooks say that Saladin granted them safety and allowed those who wanted to leave the transport of their properties and possessions. By many sources used in teaching the successes of Salahadin that caused the tables to turn are attributed to the unification of Greater Syria under Zangids. The moral is the effectiveness Muslims, or Arabs depending on the author, can accomplish when united. For the coming century, despite a number of new crusades, their sphere of influence was mostly limited to coastal areas, despite brief successes such as the temporary recapture of Jerusalem in 1229 during the Sixth Crusade. Acre, the last stronghold of importance, was lost to the Egyptian Mamelukes in 1291. Indicative of the relative disregard of this period is that the Eighth Crusade, which was directed against Tunis, is mentioned in Tunisian textbooks in just one sentence. Moving on to modern times, as can be seen by now, in Arab countries, the Crusades are hardly perceived as a remote event of little consequence. In fact, they are treated as a precursor to the later Western expansion into the region, and often linked with skepticism towards the West in general, be it from a religious or political perspective. For example, it has been viewed as a direct parallel to the founding of the State of Israel, which is seen as a result of Western intervention in the region. The Saudi Arabian textbooks, in a not-so-subtle comparison, go as far as directly asking the readers to compare the treatment of Saladin's enemies with the treatment of the Palestinian people by the Jews today. However, this is a rather modern trend, a fact that can be verified by looking at the historiography. Chroniclers of the medieval Middle East, having lived in a highly literate culture, of course documented the events of the Crusades, and their quotes often find their way into most schoolbooks in Arabic countries. But after the 15th century, there is hardly any relevant historiography on the subject. The situation began to change in the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century, when the issuance of books on the subject skyrocketed, initially linked with the formation of Arabic national perception, identifying the Crusader period as a kind of foundation myth regarding the joined Arab identity. This was not hindered by the fact that the most well-known commanders of the time, such as Imad al-Din Zengi, Toghtekin, and even Salah al-Din himself, weren't ethnic Arabs. The union of parts of Greater Syria with that of Egypt under Saladin was designated an example for the efforts to politically unite Syria and Egypt that led to the short-lived United Arab Republic between 1958 and 1961. Additionally, the Crusade era acted as a cautionary tale, again with rather on-the-nose present-day parallels. The revisionism acted on two levels. The conflict tended to be viewed as an example of a major clash of cultures, treating modern conflicts in the region as a continuation of Crusader policies. Here, it is served as proof of the true barbaric nature of the West. On the other hand, it warned against disunity among the Arab people. These views are widespread in all extreme anti-West groups, such as ISIS, where in their inflammatory rhetoric, the word Crusader is always present when mentioning Western intervention. Ironically, this reference to Crusaders has been used when referring to countries such as Russia, which had nothing to do with the Crusades whatsoever. For example, in 2015, Reuters reported on an audio message by the Islamic State spokesperson Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who encouraged Islamic youth everywhere ignite jihad against the Russians and the Americans in their Crusaders' war against Muslims. But this is not an isolated incident. In fact, it seems to be a theme in the background of all instances of the past 100 years when Western powers opposed Middle Eastern ones. An early example where the parallels to Crusades seem out of place relates to the Turkish victory in the 1920s against foreign powers, which resulted in the formation of a secular Turkey, but also in the 1922 expulsion of the Greek-speaking populace from within the borders of modern-day Turkey. This can sometimes, especially through the rise of political Islam in Turkey in recent years, be somehow paralleled with the expulsion of the Crusaders from Asia. Historically speaking, this may seem at least misdirected, as the Greek presence in Asia Minor preceded the Turkish one by literally thousands of years. But it is indicative of how the rhetoric of Crusaders has been on the rise recently, and how it now seems to include any Western action or even criticism directed towards the dealings of the Turkish government. In 2017, the Turkish President Erdogan himself made such a comparison when he denounced the West's Crusader mentality after Western politicians criticized a referendum after which he was allegedly bestowed with authoritarian powers. But the main field where analogies with Crusaders are notably high are statements issued concerning Israel. Even before the foundation of Israel in 1948, for example, Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was quoted by the New York Times as saying, "If the Jewish state becomes a fact, and this is realized by the Arab peoples, they will drive the Jews who live in their midst into the sea." Similar statements, this time referring to the newly arrived Jewish settlers, have been attributed to the circle around the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1960s. Indeed, Arab scholars, writers, and politicians have repeatedly nurtured the Crusader myth when referring to Zionism and Israelism in order to prove that Israel is a Western colonialist entity in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially when the legitimacy of Israel is being questioned by organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and even elements within Iran. The Crusader metaphor gets repeatedly trotted out even today. Generally, however, this equating of Crusaders with modern Western countries is not limited to extremist groups, but also to more moderate, peace-seeking ones that
are skeptical of the West. This, at least in part, is linked with what they learned in schools regarding the period. The strong focus on the initial atrocities committed by the invading Western warriors, with less to negligible mentions of cultural exchange and other aspects that are part of the era's history. But in the end, the Crusades are filled with many epic battles, feats of bravery, and heroism on both sides that are of interest to all history geeks. Such as Baldwin III, who became king of Jerusalem at 13 when he refused to abandon his army, which was in peril for the sake of safety because he was king, or chivalrous acts like Salah el-Din sending his doctor to Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, or the fact that an Arab tribesman personally saved a Crusader commander, leading him through the Muslim army to safety while putting himself in danger's way, only because some years back Baldwin was merciful towards the tribesman's captured pregnant wife. Even a modus vivendi was reached, with tales of friendship between the locals and the Crusader settlers that lived there for a long time. But it is important to remember that the First Crusade in particular, and especially all new Crusaders that kept arriving through the whole period, were indoctrinated with fanaticism and a black and white perception. As is always the case when such fanaticism appears in history, it led to acts of blind violence, and it is mostly this aspect that remains vivid in the people of Asia, and it is rhetoric devised from it that keeps fueling the Western skeptic factions in Arab, Iranian, and Turkish people with argumentation for the evil nature of the West.
At its peak, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, encompassing nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface and more than one quarter of its population. Throughout history, this massive geopolitical entity was perceived by its proponents as a beacon of civilization, an engine for trade and building local infrastructure and prosperity, a source of military and national pride. Needless to say, however, populations under its rule might have had a very different opinion about things, and probably quite keen to point out a lot of things that were glossed over in popular history. Now, in previous episodes of Today I Found Out, we've covered how the national school curricula in Germany and Japan teach pupils about the shadiest parts of their respective history, periods before and during World War II. But what about good old Blighty? How do schools in the UK teach about the British Empire? Do history teachers also cover its most negative aspects, or do they just gloss over them? Well, to begin with, the national curriculum's approach to the British Empire is extremely complex and subject to change, and is currently undergoing a pretty major review, as we'll get into later in the video. But first, let's now take a quick run through the topic at hand, starting with a very brief overview of the British Empire itself. Seems to make sense. The British Empire can be defined as a global system of territories under the sovereignty of the Great British Crown and Government. These territories include colonies, protectorates, and dominions. It's interesting to note that most of these early settlements were established by private enterprise, with no direct strategic oversight from the Crown or the government. For most of the history of the empire until the mid-19th century, the Crown had some limited powers of supervision over the acquired territories, but the colonies themselves were largely self-managed and self-sufficient. But let's rewind just a little. England first started its colonial path by invading Ireland in 1169, fully reconquered by the Tudors in the 16th century. And yet, the official start and end dates of the empire have been set at 1601 and 1997. So, what happens here? In the 17th century, England established its first transatlantic colonies in North America and the Caribbean, mainly driven by commercial ambition and a strategy to stem French influence over the area. Around the same time, the privately owned East India Company began establishing trading posts in India and Southeast Asia. Continuing the trend, in the 1660s, England extended its reach into the African continent by settling into modern-day Gambia. Over the following 2 centuries, England first and Great Britain later colonized much of Africa, establishing a chain of territories from Cairo to Cape Town. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Brits were on a roll. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 unlocked the door to what would become Canada, and the East India Company continued its expansion at the expense of their French counterpart and local Bengali rulers. There was the occasional, yet major setback, of course, such as the loss of the 13 American colonies following the Revolutionary War of 1776, but even that came with some major advantages, as Britain very purposefully gave the new nation insanely favourable terms in the deal, as we've covered in one of our personal favourite videos that we've done, the time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued, which goes in depth into the start, middle and end of the revolution, and the rather fascinating and hilarious two contrasting individuals in those two men who played such critical roles, as well as covers in detail why Ben Franklin advocated so strongly that elderly women were the best to sleep with. Okie dokie. But going back to these colonists and the terrorist organization that took control of them and subsequently mass murdered so many British soldiers just there trying to earn a living, France and the newly minted United States were bosom buddies at this point, which was a major problem for the British both at the time and very possibly could have turned into a catastrophic problem if that future was allowed to continue. Thus, in a bit of a double cross, which honestly, what more could you expect from already traitors to king and country, the colonists decided to throw France, without whom they'd definitely have lost the war, completely under the bus at the last minute, in exchange for those insanely favourable terms from the British. As for the British side, then British Prime Minister Lord William Petty, Earl of Shelburne, felt that in granting the United States such favourable terms, they also positioned the US to prosper to a great degree while simultaneously helping to open up very favourable trade with them, which would benefit British merchants as well as help supply the British Empire with much needed resources. This would also all hopefully foster a decent amount of goodwill towards Britain from the new nation and potentially help ensure that the relationship between France and the US didn't continue to mature unchecked at the expense of Britain. And in retrospect, while the now dubbed special relationship between the British and Americans wasn't always smooth in the aftermath, on the whole, such friendly relations with their former colonies has served the UK extremely well and has been a boon to the United States as well. So much so that the US Department of State's webpage on the relationship between the US and the UK starts off, "The United States has no closer ally than the United Kingdom. Following the end of the American Revolution in 1783, in 1785 our two countries established diplomatic relations. Other than a brief break in relations during the War of 1812, the United States and United Kingdom have remained durable partners and allies. Our partnership is the foundation of our mutual prosperity and security." Not just teaming up in matters of war and security, the two nations are among each other's biggest trade partners. They also share the world's largest foreign investment partnership. And as UK Foreign Secretary William Hague noted in 2013, every day almost 1 million people go to work in America for British companies that are in the United States, just as more than 1 million go to work here in Great Britain for American companies that are here. But going back to matters of less importance in the nation's respective histories, even in defeat on this one, the British Empire was advancing, and the building of the empire resumed in the following decades. Australia was settled in 1788 and Malacca in 1795. Then the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars resulted in the acquisition of further former French territories. These were mainly island colonies such as Ceylon, Trinidad, Tobago, St. Lucia, and Malta, which made for great trading posts and bases for the Royal Navy. New Zealand was colonized in 1840, followed by expansion in the Pacific. In 1857, as a consequence of the mutiny of the East India Company's private troops, the Crown assumed control in the subcontinent, and, as mentioned earlier, in the late 19th and early 20th century, Britain completed its expansion in Africa. And I'm certain that everyone is going to have fun pointing out in the comments which territories were not mentioned and which wars of conquest were ironically glossed over. But the point we wanted to make is that the history of the British Empire is an extremely long and extremely complex topic that quite literally spans the globe. And all of this, contrary to extreme points of view on the other side, there were undeniable positive effects at points, some intentional, others less so. And when it comes to controversy and ramifications, one should acknowledge what could be considered the positive aspects of imperialism as well as its more sinister consequences. On the former, British civil servants and private enterprises developed modern infrastructure in the colonized areas. They created a global trade network, allowing colonies, dominions, and protectorates to access lucrative markets on the other side of the world. Colonial administration standardized education across the globe, created job opportunities in the civil service and the military, and introduced modern legislature and administration practices. The process of building the empire is a remarkable achievement in itself, a testament to the skill, competence, courage, and leadership of the British military, merchant sailors, and explorers. Of course, in all of this, the British Empire was also responsible for some of the worst atrocities and violations of human rights in relatively modern history, even if it's glossed over in Britain's own history books, as we're about to get into. Which, to be fair, as we outlined in our unfortunately age-restricted 2-hour documentary Swept Under the Rug, The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, which is the best video that we've probably ever produced, not just the Japanese, but the United States too committed mind-boggling amounts of crimes against humanity during the Pacific Theater as something of a matter of course, yet virtually none of this is ever mentioned in either country's academic history books, generally left to university lecturers and the likes of us to dig into. This is a theme with basically every single nation in history, with how they cover their own history in schools, with the stark exception being Germany. And some, perhaps rightly, have argued that the Germans go too far the other way, hammering their own atrocities home, so much so that the youth of today not only have learned the lessons from them, as is very good, but also have unfortunately developed a bit of a major collective guilt complex about it, even though neither they, nor their parents, nor even in many cases their grandparents had anything to do with any of it. Now,
Going back to the British Empire, the atrocities of their own have nonetheless been confirmed by the UK government itself. For example, in 2011, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office confessed to keeping 20,000 classified files which included incriminating evidence of murder and torture by British colonial authorities. So, before we cover how all this is taught specifically, we should probably also very briefly dive into those imperial atrocities so little discussed. To begin with, British troops and their colonial units were enthusiastic proponents of using concentration camps to control hostile local populations. The tactic was first used against the Boers in South Africa in the early years of the 20th century. During the 1950 Malayan emergency, camps known as New Villages were built to keep Chinese civilians under tabs lest they support the local independence movement. And then again, in 1964, up to 1.5 million Kikuyu people were detained at camps in Kenya as a means to quash the Mau Mau uprising. When not forcibly locking up astounding numbers of people for no morally justifiable reason, imperial troops distinguished themselves in massacring civilians to quell unrest or slaughtering poorly armed local militias in the context of unprovoked invasions. An example of the former case can be illustrated by the massacre in Amritsar, Punjab, which took place on April 13, 1919. That's when the British Indian Army fired over an unarmed crowd, killing upwards of 1,000 civilians. Yet another is the 1903 British invasion of Tibet. This was staged to preempt a potential Russian offensive. The operation resulted in a massacre via machine gunning of 700 local militias armed with flintlock muskets. When not causing death by bullets, the British Empire also had another common human weapon of mass destruction at their disposal, and that's incompetence, often compounded by callousness. Through a combination of poor administration, carelessness, disdain towards populations perceived as inferior, or plain idiocy, British colonial authorities annihilated hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives through their actions, even if that wasn't really the original intent of said actions. The most blatant example is the partition of the Indian subcontinent into Pakistan and India. An operation so thoroughly mishandled that it caused the mass migration of 10 million people and the death of 1 million as a consequence of sectarian violence. Other examples include the introduction of smallpox to Australia and the mismanagement of crop failures in India and Ireland, which led to terrifying famines of catastrophic proportions. This carousel of colonial horrors would not be complete without a mention of the transatlantic slave trade. Sure, other European powers took part in this practice, and undoubtedly African kingdoms took an active role by happily selling captured prisoners of war into slavery. But the role played by England first and Britain later is pivotal. The first English ship transporting slaves from Africa to America set sail in 1562, captained by John Hawkins. Hawkins sold his human cargo to Spanish colonists in America, raking in an enormous profit. Over the 17th century, demand for unpaid labor skyrocketed also in the English possessions in the New World, propelled by the expanding demand for sugarcane crops. By the late 18th century, more than half of all of the African slaves transported across the Atlantic were carried by British ships. Around the same period, in 1787, campaigners Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp founded the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which raised awareness about the inhumane conditions of African slaves, boycotted goods produced through slavery, and petitioned Parliament. Petitions were led by MP William Wilberforce, and after years of failed attempts in 1807, the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire. But up to that point, some 11,000 ships had sailed from British ports with the purpose of transporting and selling people across the Atlantic, with countless thousands dying along the way, and the ones who made it left to a life of slavery, sometimes under extremely brutal conditions. To their credit, following that date, the Royal Navy took an active role in patrolling the Atlantic waters, cracking down on those traders who defied the ban, as we discussed in our recent video, The True Story of the Amistad. However, slavery itself was not abolished until 1838, after which the slave owners, not the slaves, received compensation from the government. Again, you can absolutely have a field day by pointing out which atrocities we failed to include on this list, because had we covered it all, or in any further detail even than we did, this video would likely have set the record for the world's longest YouTube video ever, and not only been demonetized, but age restricted as well, as happened to our aforementioned video about the truth about the Japanese Holocaust. But please do be our guest, discuss as many things as you wish in the comments below. I don't think they can demonetize us for that. All that out of the way, let's now finally look at the British Empire in the UK syllabus. To begin with, on this, Anira Rose McClue, former teacher and member of Facing History and Ourselves UK, a charity that uses the teaching of history to challenge bigotry and racism, states, "The history we learn in educational institutions and wider society concerning the British Empire is incomplete. The stories that dominate tend to amplify the voices of the colonizers, depicting the imperial period as a time of glory and greatness, while the plunder, oppression, and destruction of indigenous peoples and their societies and cultures often occupies, at most, a footnote. We hear how Britain's empire left behind sporting traditions, trade networks, education, and democracy, as if those subjected to colonialism wouldn't have come to these themselves, but learn little of how much of Britain's current wealth can be traced back to the suffering, exploitation, and enslavement of millions of fellow human beings in overseas territories." End quote. In her article, Rose McClue quotes a March 2020 survey in which 33% of respondents believe that former British colonies were better off overall for having been a part of the empire. She then goes on to comment that if the brutal realities of the colonial past of the British government were taught in schools and discussed more within wider society, those survey results would no doubt be very different. Historian William Dalrymple chimes in on all of this, saying, "The British history curriculum moves suddenly from Florence Nightingale to the Nazis, so that Britain always seems to be on the side of liberation, freeing people. You learn about the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, all sorts of empires, just not the British Empire. The fact that we conquered half the globe was, bizarrely, left off the curriculum." He goes on, "Now more than ever, we badly need to understand what is common knowledge elsewhere, that for much of history we were an aggressively racist and expansionist force responsible for violence, injustice, and war crimes on every continent." End quote. As for more specifics, up until the period post-World War II, history lessons dedicated ample time to the empire with a nationalistic approach. In other words, teachers and teaching material covered the glorious exploits of British politicians, administrators, sailors, and soldiers, emphasizing military victories against rival colonial powers and invaded territories. As a consequence, the most unsavory aspects of British colonial rule were just mostly ignored. In the 1950s and 60s, another school of thought took hold called New History. This approach stressed the importance of understanding and analyzing the experiences and point of view of the populations involved in historical events rather than their leaders. Monarchs and generals faded into the background in favor of a bottom-up method founded on empathy for those who suffered from the tidal waves of history. In this context, any patriotic or nationalistic feelings were expunged from the classrooms. The history of the British Empire was mostly sidelined or downgraded, with the exception of Britain's role in the slave trade. This was, and still is, an incredibly important subject to tackle, but the history syllabus was not standardized across the nation, and it was up to the discretion of the individual teacher whether to include slavery or not. In 1991, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher introduced a national curriculum to introduce some sort of standardization across all subjects. In her memoirs, Thatcher claimed that it had been easier to fight the Argentinians in the Falkland Islands than to agree on a national history curriculum with teachers and historians. Her Secretary of State for Education, Kenneth Baker, had some clear views on how to portray the empire in the new curriculum. To quote him, "Pupils should be taught about the spread of Britain's influence for good throughout the empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. These things are matters in which we should take great pride." But the end result was a syllabus which covered the history of Great Britain in chronological order, yet leaving ample discretion to teachers on what topics to cover in detail. Once again, a holistic history of the empire was largely left out, with the exception of slavery. The National Curriculum for History was revised in February 2013 by David Cameron's Conservative government. The proposal for renewal of the syllabus included topics such as English colonization of the Americas and India, the occupation of Ireland, and a large module called Britain's Global Impact in the 19th Century, which would span the scramble for Africa, expansion in Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent and the Boer Wars. Despite it mentioning the 19th century, the module would also include the post-World War II independence movements and the immigration into Britain of citizens from Commonwealth countries. The overall intention was to accord more importance and time to the empire, with exhortations from the cabinet to present it in a largely positive light. The end result was a syllabus which did include some imperial topics, but once again, it was up to individual teachers to decide what and how to teach their pupils, if anything at all. Now, all of that said, in very recent years, the issue of imperial instruction has taken centre stage in British Parliament. Following an online petition, the House of Commons held a debate on Monday the 28th of June 2021 to discuss how Britain's colonial past was addressed in UK schools. Labour MP Chris Evans quoted Dr. Deanna Heath, who teaches Southern Asian and Imperial colonial history at the University of Liverpool.
I face an uphill struggle at the start of each new academic year. Many of the undergraduates who greet me know virtually nothing about any of the subjects I teach." End quote. Other MPs from both Labour and the Scottish National Party agreed that schools oversimplified Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as largely omitting the contributions of non-white historical personalities. This omission extends also to the struggles of the lower classes, with Labour MP Bel Ribeiro Addy suggesting that this exclusion is both racially and class-driven. The response from the Conservative majority was simply to point out that as of 2021, the British Empire and Britain's colonial past were a statutory theme for the Key Stage 3 history curriculum. To clarify, Key Stage 3 responds to pupils aged 11 to 14, and a statutory theme indicates a theme which must be covered as part of history lessons. The selection of the specific topics within a statutory theme, however, is once again down to the choice of the individual teacher. So, we took a peek into the current national syllabus for the UK. And as of June 2023, the Key Stage 3 curriculum includes 2 statutory themes related to the Empire. The first is Ideas, Political Power, Industry and Empire, Britain 1745 to 1901. Topics contained within include the transatlantic slave trade, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the relationship with Ireland, and the development of the British Empire with a depth study. The second theme is Challenges for Britain, Europe, and the wider world, 1901 to the present day, which features topics such as the World Wars, Indian independence, and the end of the Empire. So in theory, the Empire should be a part of what preteens and early teens learn about in school, and in theory, there are plenty of chances to discuss all facets of imperialism, including Britain's role in rather extreme crimes against humanity. But in practice, this is not always the case. So in preparation for this video, we asked a small sample of students, teachers, and one retired head teacher about their individual experiences. In all cases, they replied that these themes and topics simply had not been touched. More than a concerted effort to sweep a shameful past under the carpet, it appears that history teachers do not have the time to fit these supposedly statutory themes into an already packed curriculum. And yet, there is plenty of available resources for some teachers to develop lessons on our colonial past. For example, education consultant Neil Thompson, through his company Key Stage History, provides a good sample of imperial topics which may have been taught by Key Stage 3 teachers as part of the statutory themes. Examples include an in-depth module about the slave trade and how it was propelled by the soaring demand for sugary products, which required a massive unpaid workforce for the sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. This module would then delve into the horrific conditions of the individual slaves, the status of African servants in rich households, and how they were portrayed in 17th and 18th century art. The lessons would then conclude with the abolitionist campaigns and Britain's role in policing the illegal slave trade. Another wide-ranging topic apparently largely ignored is British rule in India. Thompson recounts a module spanning 4 centuries of history, from the birth of the East India Company to Indian independence, without shying away from events such as the Amritsar massacre or the recurrent famines. Finally, Thompson proposes for teachers to stimulate classroom discussion on the British Empire as a whole, for example by asking, how did Britain achieve to conquer such a large empire? How did the empire eventually dissolve? And to discuss the pros and cons of the empire itself. And at this stage, we'd really like to hear from you, our esteemed audience. If you hail from the UK, like me, let us know if and what you were taught about any of these subjects when you were at school. More interesting, if you hail from a country formerly part of the empire, how were you taught about British colonisation? Now, moving on from there is potentially good news on the horizon for relatively accurate history being taught in UK schools. Back in March of 2022, the Department of Education announced the preparation of a new model history curriculum, which should be issued in 2024. This curriculum should, to quote, equip teachers with the skills to lead lessons that cover migration and cultural change, and to help pupils understand the intertwined nature of British and global history and their own place within it.
We've all heard of him. Alexander the Great has been, for many centuries, a household name in much of the world. An impressive feat for a king who's been dead for 2 millennia and only reigned for a little over a decade. In Western countries, his defeat of the Persian Empire in the 320s BC has often been depicted as bringing culture to barbarian lands, and thus the events of his life are put in a context of the clash between East and West. As you can imagine, however, there is another side to the story, and indeed to history, the one of the defeat defeated Persians. And if you have seen our video on how the Crusades are taught in these regions, we are always interested in discussing what a historical event we might know from one point of view looked like from the other side. So, how do the defeated peoples view Alexander, and who first called him Alexander the Great anyway? To begin with, a little background to his greatness. As King Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander ruled from 336 to 323 BC. He was born as the son of King Philip II, came into power when he was 20 years old, and died 13 years later as a living legend, undefeated in battle, but brought to heel only by an unidentified sickness. During his short reign, he managed the unthinkable. Not only did he secure the unity of the Greek nations under his banner, but he also went on to begin a streak of conquests so successful the world would arguably never see their like again, though certainly not for lack of try. In fact, despite many anecdotes highlighting different aspects of his character, such as cutting the unsolvable Gordian knot, Alexander must be best known for being a major role model for a huge number of significant historical figures that came after him. Not just admired after death, generally the first in line of battle, he was reportedly loved by the soldiers and heralded as an example of excellent leadership. From his practice of literally leading his men into battle, unsurprisingly, he was almost killed countless times and regularly got injured trying to imitate his personal hero, Achilles. One of the many examples of this comes from the siege of a Malian city along the Indus River in the winter of 325, when Alexander grabbed a ladder and led his men up it himself. The ladder broke and he found himself alone on top of a wall. Instead of jumping back down to safety, he dove inside the city with only 2 comrades. Somehow he survived the ordeal, walking away with nothing but an arrow in the chest, although that sounds fairly terrible. Naturally, his comrades and even his enemies were impressed at his boldness and courage. For his people, who had their entire world established around the shores of the East Mediterranean, the experience of reaching lands previously unheard of up to the Indus River seemed like a mythical experience happening in their lifetime. The very fact that Alexander's military achievements surpassed anything the Greeks had hitherto known also made a big difference in propelling him to godhood. This went right down to performing miracles, like reports of the sea retreating to let him pass near Phaselis, or being greeted as the son of Ammon Zeus by priests in Egypt. In other instances, he was shown to even surpass other gods, for example during the attack on the Ormus fortress that, according to legend, even Hercules could not conquer. The worship of Alexander is a complex phenomenon. Although it was based on an existing tradition, it still differs from both his immediate predecessors and later developments. His cult was established in many cities in Asia Minor, probably already during his campaign in response to his achievements and his benefactions. An important difference from the cult of both earlier mortals and of later kings is the wide diffusion, popularity, and persistence of Alexander's worship, which in some places lasted until the Christian era. Moving on from his boldness, Alexander was also a savvy politician. The attack on the Persians was strongly portrayed as just vengeance of the Greek peoples, of whom Alexander was declaring himself leader, in response to the Persian attacks of Xerxes and Darius against Greece 150 years earlier. These were the Persian Wars of 490 to 479 BC, with the whole big fuss about Marathon and This Is Sparta, which were very traumatizing for the Greek subconscious. Thus, by getting revenge for this, he helped unite these groups under his banner. Alexander's revenge policy culminated in perhaps the most hideous act Alexander the Great committed during his illustrious career, a deed he allegedly regretted after the fact, namely the burning of Persepolis, the symbolic capital and sacred ground of the Persian kings. By ancient historians, it was regarded as a political act, a sort of mission-accomplished move in direct, vengeful parallel to the burning of Athens by Xerxes in 480 BC. In an effort to remove the blame from Alexander, some also accuse an Athenian girl of having proposed this during the feast, with the troops burning the ancient city under the influence of alcohol, and with sobriety came Alexander's regret. Of course, it is very convenient that gold and other valuables were removed from the city first in a very orderly, non-drunken fashion, in preparation for the destruction. Another thing to chalk up to earning the Great moniker was his pivotal role in the formation of the so-called Hellenistic world, which now consisted of all of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Israel and Syria. These regions, although holding on to their traditional values, the Maccabees participated in the new Greek and later Roman civilization and helped in the distribution of historically significant ideas and even religion. Unsurprisingly, conquering the known and partially unknown world in a series of
victories that stretched from the Danube to the Punjab and the Indus River without being defeated once, all the while living life to the fullest, fighting by day and partying at night until his sudden death, or between the age of 20 and 33, won him the epithet the Great. However, it wasn't the Greeks that came up with the moniker, but the Romans, as the first known historian to call him that was Quintus Curtius Rufus, a 1st century AD historian. And the earliest mention we have of Alexander Magnus, the Great in Latin, is in a play written by Titus Marcius Plautus around 200 BC, so more than 100 years after the death of Alexander. But the name stuck, and it is an indicator of the Alexander hype having reached the young and growing Roman Empire. On that note, many historically significant imitators came after, such as Roman general Pompey the Great, who not only adopted the same epithet, Magnus, but also Alexander's hairdo. He also imitated Alexander in other aspects of his life, such as the friendly attitude towards his subordinates, or his habit of naming cities after himself, a fact still visible in places like Pamplona, Spain, which comes from Pompeiopolis, the camp of Pompeius during the civil war against Sartorius around 75 BC. In his biography of Caesar, Plutarch also states that when Caesar was reading from the history of Alexander, he burst into tears, realizing he could never accomplish what Alexander had accomplished by the age of 33. Moving on from there, Octavian, the future first emperor Augustus, visited Alexandria in 31 BC after defeating Cleopatra. There, Suetonius informs us, he made a great deal out of honoring Alexander's grave by reverently placing a golden crown there. When his guides asked him if he would like to view other important tombs of the Ptolemies, the last pharaohs, he abruptly dismissed the suggestion by saying that he came because he wanted to see a king, not dead men. But that's the Western perspective. So how was Alexander perceived and taught by the people he conquered and those in the region that came after? To begin with, very quickly following Alexander's conquest, some of the Persians regrouped to form the Parthian Empire, more or less around today's Iran, then bordering the Hellenistic world and its later Roman successors to the west. From their point of view, they did not necessarily distinguish between the terms Greek kingdoms and Roman Empire, as to their eyes, these two groups belonged to the same cultural group. In 224 AD, a revolution brought a change in the name and the attitude of the empire. Namely, it saw the rise of what would become the arch-nemesis of the Roman Empire, the Sassanids. Their policy was a conscious callback to the good old days and aimed to revive the glory of the Achaemenid Empire, the one that Alexander conquered over 500 years prior, implying their intention to reclaim all of the lands that were once part of said empire and which now lay deep within the Roman domain. The Sassanids' declared maxim could be seen in all forms of expression as a renaissance of Achaemenid art and style. Even archaism in language was all around. To understand this anachronistic tendency, imagine an English person walking around downtown Manhattan in colonial clothes and speaking Shakespearean English. He's either a history geek cosplayer or he's up to something. Now imagine a whole culture doing this. Some of the things the Sassanids revived would remain very important elements in Eastern symbols, such as the crescent moon and star, then reappearing on coins and monuments as elements of the Sassanid king's crown. A common theme that emerged was the valuable centers of their religion were destroyed by the troops of Alexander the Great. Tales of Alexander paying respect to the founder of the Achaemenids, King Cyrus, or other noble behavior meant little for the Magi, the Zoroastrian priesthood, for whom the destruction was nothing short of a calamity. And according to the Iranians, the desolation did not just extend to the temples, but also had ravaged the sacred scripture as well. The Avesta, the holy book of Zoroastrianism, was said to have been lost in the destruction of Persepolis. From the early Sassanid period onwards, Alexander is referred to by the epithet Gujastak in Persian literature, meaning accursed. A famous book stemming from around the 3rd or 4th century, Art of Viraf Namak, tells of a valuable copy of the Avesta in the Achaemenid archives in Persepolis that was destroyed by Alexander of the Romans. As alluded to, Roman and Greek were regarded as the same. From their side, an ideological spear point was, similar to propaganda Alexander himself used to get revenge upon the Persians, the idea of vengeance, seeking to rectify the sacrilege of Alexander, who had burned Persepolis and destroyed the sacred texts of Ahura Mazda, the sacred Avestus. From the Roman side, clashes with the Parthians had become routine, but now suddenly it became an ideological matter. This was quickly felt from Ardashir and Shapur, the first two rulers of the Sassanids, infamous to the Romans as a constant threat. They even managed to capture the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260
AD, who thus became the first Roman emperor to be taken as a prisoner of war, causing shockwaves in the Roman world. All of this came with an unexpected benefit, however. In early medieval times, many works of literature and science were lost due to the decayed interest in things that were not purely about praising the emperor or dealing with religious matters. The main way much of the ancient knowledge was saved was a trend of translating Latin and Greek authors to Middle Persian and later into Arabic. The beginning of this trend had a surprising link to the propaganda against Alexander the Great. A first systematic interest in translations of works of scientists and philosophers in the Middle East can be traced back to the time of the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Sassanid ideology up to the 6th century AD emphasized the superiority of the Persian tradition and explained the advances of other rival states, such as the East Roman Empire, Byzantium, as knowledge scattered from ancient Persia. Namely, they accused Alexander the Great of stealing the ancient Persian knowledge from the palatial library, where the sacred books were kept, to later benefit of the Greeks. This rhetoric was linked with the ties that the Sassanids tried to form to Achaemenid Persia and was used politically during the constant conflicts with the Roman and Byzantium empires. This way, the Sassanids saw themselves as guardians of the ancient knowledge that was returning from Roman territory to the Middle East, where, according to their view, it had initially originated. Thus, a nationalistic propaganda that actually saved books for a change. This transfer often happens in the form of books brought by Nestorian refugees, former citizens of the Roman and Byzantium Empire, who established schools for the Sassanid Persian Empire, for example, in Jundishapur, where they were involved mainly in medicine, but also dealt with other philosophical subjects. This trend would continue later by the Arabic-speaking Abbasid dynasties. But what about Iran today? What do they think of Alexander and his supposed greatness? Does it follow their Sassanid predecessors in the criticism of Alexander? Well, the answer is yes, but also no. Alexander of Macedon is again portrayed as the destroyer of their ancient empire. But since other parts of their history are far more focused on for political or religious reasons, these events are not typically greatly discussed in the education system. One of the reasons is the revival of the nationalistic Persian pride around the Achaemenid Empire, which was undertaken by the Shah of Persia, the one that the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979 overthrew. In 967, he had taken the title Shah, or King of Kings, that the ancient Persian kings had carried before. As part of his efforts to modernize Iran and give the Iranian people a non-Islamic identity, he began the effort to celebrate Iranian history before the Arab conquest. An effort culminating in the celebrations at Persepolis in 1971 for the 2500th anniversary of the coronation of Cyrus the Great, the first Achaemenid king. This celebration was criticized by Khomeini and his followers, who would later found the Islamic Republic and who called it the Devil's Festival. So in the end here, it's not like the Achaemenid Empire has disappeared from the national identity, far from it, but it is not necessarily in the foreground, as the Islamic Republic has other things that they want to focus on. More specifically, in the modern Iranian standard schoolbooks, Alexander does appear somewhat prominently in 3 subjects. The first reference comes from the social studies textbook taught in primary years, which includes the discussion of Iran's historical sites, including Persepolis. Alexander's successes in Persia and the dissemination of Greek customs and language are mentioned, but the expedition itself, its battles, or even the burning of Persepolis is completely missing. In the 7th grade, so concerning around 12-year-olds, the Persian Empire is presented analytically, and so is the invasion of Greece, but no mention is given to the burning of Athens. Here, the invasion of Alexander is described in some detail. It is similarly treated within the 4th grade of secondary education, age 15. As Fatima Faridi Majid noted, in all, the Iranian books do not report the destructions in Greece, such as the burning of Athens, although they admit the weaknesses of the Achaemenids, to which they ascribe Alexander's conquests, and also mention the burning of Persepolis and other cities more than once. For Iranians, the Persian Wars and Alexander's conquest of Persia are generally seen as short interludes in their long, turbulent history. Therefore, Alexander's deeds are seen as an act of foreign infiltration, but it is not as big an issue as, say, the Crusades. As other issues have become prevalent, it is no longer as important as it was for their ancestors, the Sassanids. Of course, the negative depictions are not necessarily representative of the Alexander tradition, as he was integrated into myths and legends of various people as a semi-mythical king or personality. Even so, even in Persia, the mythical aspect prevailed. This is best seen in the Persian 11th century poet Faruqi Sistani in the introduction of some Alexander stories. It reads, "The acts of Sikander, Alexander, the tale of his exploits and where he went, have so much been heard by men wide and far, his story now is known to all by heart."
As Mendeghi in a 2019 article mentions, to give an example of the popularity of Alexander's story in the Persian tradition, it is worth mentioning that in Kakwani's 12th century divans and Farruki's and Unshuri's 11th century divans alone, Alexander and his deeds are mentioned more than 30 times. One of the most important works of literature of the Persian language, the 11th century epic Shahnameh, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, includes Alexander in a line of legitimate Persian shahs, a mythical figure who explored the far reaches of the world in search for the Fountain of Youth. The trend of connecting mythical elements with Alexander began soon after his death. One such example is when Lysander, a general of his, heard a story in his late years that Alexander had met with the queen of the Amazons. He ironically answered, "And where was I during this?" Contemporary philosophers noticed the increasing mythical elements of the historical occurrences of Alexander in both high and popular literature. Some were smart enough to recognize that they were witnessing the birth of legends and future myths. One of these was the philosopher Euhemerus, who asserted that the origin of the Greek gods was likely similar, and that must have been kings or benefactors to the people who had thus earned a claim to the veneration of their subjects. His most extreme example was that of the highest Greek god Zeus, who was originally a king of Crete who had been a great conqueror. This rationalizing method of interpretation is named after the philosopher and is now known as Euhemerism and is considered one of the first schools of atheism. In the end, Alexander the Great does, in many ways, live up to his epithet as the prime example of how a historical personality can inspire numerous generations across several cultures and, in the end, continued to change history in significant ways long after his death, owing to his many imitators who sought to mimic and outdo their idol.